Welcome to Lotus Whisper, Zen Tales for Sleep. Tonight, we explore a quiet journey inward to a place where the heart holds its unspoken burdens. We all carry memories of past mistakes, moments of regret that can feel like a heavy stone resting within our chest. This weight constricts our breath, clouds our thoughts, and keeps us from the deep, restorative peace of sleep. It is the echo of a story we tell ourselves, a story of fault and failure. But what if we could learn to soften our grip on this story? What if forgiveness was not about erasing the past, but about gently letting go of the struggle? Tonight's tale is about this very release. It is a story of how, when you forgive yourself, the heart finally learns to breathe again, finding space, stillness, and the path to peaceful rest. Please subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this. Part 1. The Weight of a Stone Heart. The pre-dawn air in the zendo was cool and still, thick with the scent of aged cedarwood and the faint sweet memory of yesterday's incense. Outside, the world was awash of deep indigo, holding its breath just before the first hint of light would touch the distant mountains. Inside, shadows clung to the corners of the meditation hall, softened by the gentle, flickering glow of a single oil lamp. It was a place of profound peace, a vessel built to hold silence. For the monks who sat in neat rows on their dark cushions, this was the most sacred time of day, a moment to settle the mind and greet the world from a place of quiet clarity. But for Kaito, the silence was not empty. It was full. It was a roaring, echoing chamber for the single heavy truth that he carried within him. He sat in the traditional half-lotus posture, his back straight, his hands resting in the cosmic mudra in his lap. To any observer, he was the very picture of serene discipline, a young monk dedicated to the path. But beneath the simple brown robe, his body was a landscape of tension. His shoulders were drawn tight, pulled slightly toward his ears as if bracing for a blow. His jaw was clenched, a hard knot of muscle that ached with a dull, persistent fire, and his breath, the very anchor of his practice, was a shallow, timid thing, afraid to venture too deep into his body. It was because of the stone. He did not know when it had first formed, but it was there now, lodged firmly in the center of his chest. It was not a physical stone, of course, but it had all the properties of one. It was heavy, so heavy that it seemed to pull his entire being downward, making each movement, each breath, an effort against a relentless gravity. It was cold, a pocket of deep winter that no amount of warm tea or sunlight could touch, and it was hard, unyielding, a dense knot of regret that resisted every attempt to soften it, to understand it, to simply let it be. He tried to begin his meditation as he had been taught 1,000 times by the abbot, Master Jinsei. He brought his awareness to the tip of his nose, to the place where the air entered and left his body. 1. The first inhalation, cool against his nostrils. The first exhalation, slightly warmer. 2. The instruction was simple. Count to 10 and then begin again. If the mind wanders, gently, without judgment, guide it back to the breath. But his mind did not wander. It was captured. As he counted, the stone in his chest seemed to pulse with a cold energy. 3. The image arose, as it always did, unbidden and sharp as a shard of glass. It was the face of his younger sister, Emmy, her eyes wide and bright, with a trust he had not deserved. The memory was from the day he left his village to join the monastery, years ago now, but it felt as close as his own skin. They had stood by the old stone bridge at the edge of town. He had been full of youthful pride, a fierce and foolish certainty that he was leaving behind a world of messy emotions for one of pure, enlightened purpose. She had given him a small, clumsily woven charm of dried grass. "To keep you safe," she had whispered, her voice small. He had taken it, but his mind was already on the path ahead, on the image of himself as a great monk. She had then asked him to wait just a little longer, until their mother could come to say a proper goodbye. And that was when the sharp words had come. He had been impatient, arrogant. He had told her not to be a child, that attachments were the source of suffering, that he was leaving such things behind. He had spoken the words of the teachings, but he had used them as a weapon, a way to create distance, to hide his own fear and sadness behind a mask of spiritual superiority. The memory of her face crumpling, the charm falling from her small hand onto the dusty road, was the first layer of the stone. The memory of his own voice, cold and dismissive, was the second. And the memory of walking away without looking back, feeling a hollow victory instead of love, was the core. 4. He had lost the count. His breath was caught in his throat. The stone in his chest was no longer just a weight. It was an active, aching presence. He could feel it pressing against his ribs, making it difficult to draw a full breath. He tried to start again. 1. Inhale, exhale. But the voice of self-recrimination had already begun its familiar chant, a sutra of his own making. You were cruel. You were selfish. You call yourself a monk, but your heart is made of rock. You abandoned your family for your own pride. The voice was relentless. It knew all his weaknesses. It held up every moment of his life in the monastery as evidence of his fraudulence. When he bowed, the voice whispered, "Your bow is empty." When he chanted, it sneered, "Your words are hollow." When he sat in meditation, it laughed, "You are a fraud, pretending at peace while your heart is at war." This inner turmoil was not confined to the Zendo. It followed him throughout the day, a constant, wearying companion. Later that morning, after the meager breakfast of rice porridge and pickled vegetables, it was Kaito's turn to sweep the monastery's rock garden. It was a task that the older monks cherished. The gentle, rhythmic motion of the bamboo broom against the fine white gravel was a moving meditation, a way to bring order and harmony to the outer world as a reflection of inner calm. Kaito began to sweep, his movements stiff and mechanical. He tried to focus on the task, on the crisp sound of the gravel, on the intricate patterns he was meant to create, patterns that represented the flowing water of the universe. But his eyes saw only the dust on the road where Emmy had dropped the charm. His hands, gripping the broom, felt the phantom weight of his own arrogance. The lines he drew in the gravel were crooked, hesitant. The sweeping was not a meditation. It was a chore, another opportunity for his mind to turn on itself. He saw Master Jinsei watching him from the veranda of the main hall, his gaze gentle but perceptive. Kaito felt a hot flush of shame rise to his cheeks. He was sure the abbot could see right through him, could see the heavy stone he tried so desperately to hide. He quickly looked down, sweeping with a frantic, clumsy energy that only made the patterns worse. Even the simple act of chopping wood became a trial. The solid thud of the axe splitting the log should have been satisfying, a release of energy, a connection to the raw physical reality of the world. Other monks found a deep presence in the work, their breath synchronized with the rise and fall of the axe. But for Kaito, each swing was a blow against himself. The sharp crack of the wood was the sound of his own harsh words. The effort left him breathless, not with healthy exertion, but with a familiar anxious tightness in his chest. The pile of wood grew, but the stone inside him remained unsplit, untouched. At midday meal, the monks ate in silence, a practice designed to foster gratitude and mindfulness of the food that sustained them. Kaito held his simple lacquer bowls. He looked at the steam rising from the soup, the white purity of the rice. He knew he should feel gratitude for the farmers who grew the food, for the cooks who prepared it, for the entire web of existence that had brought this meal to him. But all he felt was a profound sense of unworthiness. The food tasted like ash in his mouth. Each bite was a reminder that he was taking nourishment he did not deserve, occupying a space in this sacred place that could be filled by someone with a purer heart. He ate quickly, mechanically, his eyes fixed on his bowl, unable to meet the gaze of the other monks. The days bled into one another, each a repetition of the last, a cycle of silent struggle, of failed meditation, and hollow chores. But the nights were the worst. The nights were when the thin veneer of monastic discipline wore away completely, leaving him alone with the stone and the voice that guarded it. In the profound quiet of his small cell, the world outside seemed to disappear. There were no chants to distract him, no work to occupy his hands. There was only the thin futon on the tatami mat, the paper screen of the window glowing with pale moonlight, and the suffocating presence of his own mind. He would lie on his back, staring into the darkness, and the memories would play not as fleeting images, but as vivid, immersive experiences. He was there again on the bridge. He could feel the sun on his neck, smell the dust of the road, see the hopeful, trusting light in his sister's eyes just before he extinguished it. He could feel the phantom weight of the charm in his hand. He would turn onto his side, curling into a ball as if to physically contain the pain in his chest. He would press his fist against his sternum, a futile attempt to push the stone out, to break it apart. Sleep, when it came, was not a refuge. It was shallow and troubled, filled with anxious dreams. He dreamt of rivers that would not flow, of bells that made no sound, of trying to chant sutras but having no voice. He would often dream he was holding a heavy, cold stone trying to offer it to the Buddha on the altar, but his arms were too weak to lift it. He would wake with a start, his heart pounding in his chest, his robe damp with a cold sweat. The stone would be there, waiting for him, heavier than ever. The lack of rest frayed his nerves and weakened his resolve. In the morning zendo, his exhaustion made it even harder to concentrate. His head would nod, and he would jerk awake with a jolt of shame. The inability to find stillness in meditation fed his sense of failure, which in turn made the stone in his chest feel denser, colder. The voice of his inner critic grew louder, more insistent. The anxiety was a closed loop, a snake eating its own tail, and he was trapped inside its coils. He began to feel a deep sense of isolation. Though he was surrounded by his brother monks, he felt utterly alone. He watched them moving through their days with a quiet grace that seemed impossibly distant. He saw the genuine peace in their faces as they sat in meditation, the easy camaraderie as they worked together in the gardens. They seemed to inhabit a world of light and air, while he was trapped in a small, dark, suffocating space within himself. How could he speak of this to them? How could he explain this formless, crushing weight? To admit his struggle felt like admitting he was a failure, that he did not belong here. And so the silence he kept became another layer around the stone, insulating it, protecting it, allowing it to grow heavier in the dark. One evening as he lay awake listening to the distant cry of a night heron, a single terrifying thought surfaced. Perhaps this was his karma. Perhaps this was his inescapable fate, to carry this stone for the rest of his life, a constant internal penance for a single moment of youthful cruelty.
Thought offered no comfort, only a cold, bleak resignation. The path of Zen was supposed to be a path to liberation, to freedom, but for Kaito, it had become a cage. He had come to the monastery to escape the messiness of the world, but he had discovered that the most difficult world to escape, the most tangled and painful one, was the one he carried inside himself. He closed his eyes, but not to sleep. He closed them against the moonlight, against the sounds of the night, against the hope of a new day. He turned his awareness inward, not to the breath, but to the familiar, painful, and unyielding presence of the stone in his heart. And he felt its weight, its coldness, its terrible, solid reality as it settled in for another long, sleepless night. The night deepened, and the monastery settled into a silence so complete it seemed to have a presence of its own. It was a silence meant to heal, to hold, to allow the mind to settle like dust in a still room. But for Kaito, this profound quiet was an amplifier. Every tiny sound became significant, a punctuation mark in the long rambling sentence of his suffering. The gentle rustle of the wind in the ancient pine trees outside his window did not sound like a lullaby. It sounded like a sad, drawn-out sigh, as if the world itself was mourning his failure. A floorboard creaked somewhere down the hall as another monk shifted in his sleep, and the sound was a stark reminder of the peaceful oblivion he could not find. He was an island of restless awareness in an ocean of tranquil dreams. He could feel the rough weave of his thin blanket against his cheek, the coolness of the tatami mat beneath his futon. His body, desperate for rest, was a catalog of aches. A dull throb had taken root behind his eyes, a familiar companion after so many sleepless nights. His stomach was a tight knot, unable to properly digest the simple food he'd eaten. He was simultaneously exhausted and painfully awake, trapped in a state of weary vigilance. The stone in his chest seemed to emanate a cold that seeped into his bones, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. His mind, unable to rest, drifted back again, not just to the moment on the bridge, but to the hours that followed. He remembered the long walk on the dusty path leading away from his village. He had forced himself to think of the Buddha, of the Dharma, of the noble life he was about to begin. He had tried to fill his mind with grand ideas of emptiness and enlightenment, but underneath it all, a small, persistent feeling of unease had pricked at him. It was the memory of his sister's fallen face, the image of the small charm lying abandoned in the dirt. He had pushed the feeling down, labeling it as worldly attachment, a weakness he needed to overcome. He had told himself that true compassion was universal, and that by leaving his family, he was serving all sentient beings. It was a beautiful, noble lie, a shield of philosophy he had used to hide from the simple, painful truth. He had hurt someone he loved, and he had been too proud to turn back. This memory was a crucial part of the stone's formation. It was not just the act itself, but the deliberate act of turning away from the pain, of burying it under a mountain of righteous justification. He had chosen pride over connection, and in doing so, he had planted a seed of discord in the soil of his own heart. Now, years later, that seed had grown into this heavy, immovable thing. Unable to lie still any longer, Kaito quietly rose from his futon. The wooden floor was cold beneath his bare feet. He slid open the paper screen of his door, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness, and stepped out onto the narrow veranda. The moon was nearly full, casting a brilliant silver light over the monastery grounds.
The rock garden he had swept so poorly that day was transformed. The white gravel glowed, an ethereal sea under the moonlight, and the dark, unmoving rocks looked like ancient islands of silence. It should have been beautiful, a scene of perfect, tranquil harmony. But Kaito saw only his own failure reflected back at him. He could still make out the faint, wavering lines his broom had made, a testament to his agitated mind. The garden's intended perfection only served to highlight his own inner chaos. He felt like a discordant note in a flawless symphony. He walked to the edge of the veranda and looked toward the main hall. Through the open doors, he could see the faint outline of the great Buddha statue, its form barely visible in the deep shadows, its presence a constant, silent anchor for the entire monastery. He found his feet carrying him there, moving without conscious thought. He stepped into the hallowed space of the zendo, the air even cooler and more fragrant than before. He stood before the altar, a small, solitary figure in the vast, dark hall. The statue's face, carved from dark, ancient wood, was serene. A faint, compassionate smile graced its lips. It was a smile that had offered comfort to generations of monks, a smile that spoke of a peace that transcends all suffering. Kaito looked at that smile and felt nothing but a vast, unbridgeable chasm. The Buddha's compassion felt distant, theoretical, a light that could not penetrate the dense reality of his own guilt. He felt the voice rise inside him again, not a whisper now, but a clear, cutting accusation. Look at you, standing here, seeking comfort. You, who could not show a moment's kindness to your own sister. This peace is not for you. This serenity is not for you. Your stone is what you have earned. Carry it. He lowered his head, unable to bear the statue's gentle gaze any longer. A wave of profound hopelessness washed over him. He had tried everything he knew. He had sat for countless hours trying to watch his thoughts. He had chanted until his throat was raw. He had thrown himself into physical labor until his muscles screamed. But
nothing worked. Nothing touched the stone. It was a part of him now, as integral as his own bones. He turned and walked back to his cell, the brief excursion having offered no relief, only a deeper confirmation of his isolation. As he slid back onto his futon, the first distant sound of the Han, the wooden block that signaled the coming dawn, echoed through the monastery. The deep, resonant tones were a call to wakefulness, a call to begin the day anew. For the other monks, it was a sound of promise. For Kaito, it was a summons to put on his robe, to straighten his back, to arrange his face into a mask of placid composure, and to begin another day of carrying the crushing, silent weight of his own heart. The night was ending, but his struggle was not. Part 2. The Unseen Chains of the Past. The days that followed were no different, each a careful tracing of the one before. The weight in Kaito's chest remained his constant, silent companion. Its presence was most acute during moments that demanded the utmost presence of mind. The tea ceremony, a practice revered in the monastery as a profound expression of Zen, had become a particular source of dread for him. It was a ritual of 4 principles: harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. For Kaito, it was an exercise in the 4 opposite states: discord, shame, impurity, and agitation. One afternoon, it was his turn to prepare and serve tea for the abbot, Master Jinsei. They sat opposite each other in the small, immaculate tea room adjacent to the main hall. A charcoal fire glowed in the sunken hearth,
its warmth a gentle counterpoint to the cool air. The only sounds were the soft hiss of the iron kettle and the whisper of the wind in the bamboo grove just outside the paper screen. This was a space designed for stillness, for every movement to be a meditation, every gesture a poem. Kaito began the ritual. He unfolded the silk cloth, the fukusa, with practiced movements, yet his fingers felt clumsy and foreign. He wiped the tea caddy and the bamboo scoop, his mind 1,000 miles away, back on a dusty road, replaying a conversation that had ended years ago. When he lifted the bamboo ladle to transfer hot water from the kettle to the tea bowl, his hand trembled. It was a slight tremor, almost imperceptible, but in the profound silence of the room, it felt like a violent earthquake. A single drop of hot water escaped the ladle and fell onto the tatami mat with a soft, accusatory sizzle. Kaito froze. A hot wave of shame washed over him. His breath caught in his throat. He did not dare to look up, but he could feel the abbot's gaze on him, a gaze as calm and deep as the forest pool behind the monastery. He quickly composed himself, finished preparing the thick green tea, and presented the bowl to the master. His bow was stiff, a gesture of apology rather than respect. Master Jinsei accepted the bowl with a quiet grace. He held it in both hands, taking a moment to appreciate its warmth and the deep, verdant color of the tea. He took a slow, deliberate sip. He did not speak of the spilled water or the tremor in Kaito's hand. He simply sat in silence, his presence filling the room not with judgment, but with an immense unconditional stillness. The silence stretched, and for Kaito it was not peaceful. It was the silence of a courtroom, the moment before a verdict is delivered. Finally, the abbot placed the empty bowl down. His voice, when he spoke, was as gentle as the steam rising from the kettle. "The tea is bitter today, Kaito, but the bitterness does not seem to come from the leaves." Kaito's head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. He quickly lowered his gaze again, staring at the grain of the wooden floor. "Forgive me, master, my practice is weak." It was the standard, humble response, a shield he had used many times before. Master Jinsei was quiet for another long moment. "It is not your practice that is weak," he said softly. "It is your practice that is heavy. You carry a great burden into this room. It is so heavy it makes your hands shake. It is so bitter it seeps into the tea." He paused, letting the words settle in the air. "Tell me, Kaito, who are you at war with?" The question pierced through Kaito's defenses. It was not an accusation, but a genuine inquiry, offered with such gentle compassion that it brought tears to the edge of his eyes. He fought them back, clenching his jaw. He could not speak. The stone in his chest felt enormous, a mountain of unspoken grief and shame. "You do not need to speak of it," the abbot continued, his voice calm and even. "But you must see it for what it is. You are haunted, but the ghost that follows you is not from the past. It is a ghost you create right now, in this moment, with every breath." Later that day, the abbot summoned Kaito to his private study. It was a simple room, lined with scrolls and books. The air smelled of old paper, ink, and the faint scent of sandalwood. Kaito knelt on the cushion before the abbot's low desk, his heart pounding with a familiar, anxious rhythm. He felt like a child called before his father, ready to be reprimanded for a hidden transgression. Master Jinsei was grinding a fresh stick of ink on a dark stone slab, his movements slow and meditative. He did not look at Kaito immediately, but continued his circular motion, creating a pool of deep, fragrant black ink. "We speak often of karma," he began, his voice a low murmur. "Many young monks misunderstand this concept. They think of it as a celestial judge who keeps a ledger of our good and bad deeds, dispensing rewards and punishments. They believe that suffering in the present is a punishment for a mistake made in the past." He dipped a fine brush into the ink, holding it poised above a clean sheet of rice paper. "But this is not the way of things. Karma is not a judge. Karma is a farmer. It is the simple, natural law of cause and effect. A seed is planted, and a plant grows. An action is taken, and a result follows. It is as impersonal and as reliable as the rain that falls or the sun that rises." He looked at Kaito then, his eyes clear and direct, yet holding no trace of accusation. "Long ago, you may have planted a seed of harshness, a moment of pride, an unkind word. That action is in the past. It is gone. It is like a footprint left in the sand at the water's edge. The tide came in long ago and washed it away. The footprint is no longer there." Kaito listened, his body rigid with tension. The abbot's words were like arrows, each one finding its mark in the center of his pain. "But you," Master Jinsei continued, his gaze softening, "you return to that beach every single day. You search for the place where the footprint once was, and when you find it gone, you use your own hands to carve it into the sand again. You create it anew, moment after moment. You look at your work and you tell yourself, 'See, the footprint is still here. My mistake is permanent.' And then you wonder why your feet are wet from the tide and why your hands are raw from the sand." He set the brush down without making a mark on the paper. "The suffering you feel now is not a punishment for what you did then. The suffering is the act of recreating the memory over and over. The suffering is the story you tell yourself about the person who made the mistake. You have forged a chain, link by painful link, and tied one end to a memory that no longer exists. You have tied the other end around your own heart, and now you drag this chain with you everywhere you go. It is heavy, is it not? It makes it hard to walk, hard to sit, hard to breathe." Kaito finally broke. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down his cheek. He did not wipe it away. He bowed his head low, his forehead nearly touching the mat. "Master," he whispered, his voice choked and raw. "The chain is so heavy. I have tried to break it, I have tried to ignore it, but it is always there. It feels real. It feels like it is a part of me. It feels real because you give it your life force," the abbot said gently. "You feed it with your attention. You water it with your regret. Think of it this way." He gestured to the open window, through which they could see the monastery's ancient well. "Imagine you are thirsty. You go to the well and draw up a bucket of clear, cool water. But as you are about to drink, you remember a time when you accidentally spilled a bucket of water. You become so consumed by the memory of the spilled water that you refuse to drink the fresh water you hold in your hands. You sit by the well, dying of thirst, staring at the dry ground where the water was once spilled. Is this wise?" "No, master," Kaito said, his voice barely audible. "The past is the spilled water. It is gone. It cannot quench your
thirst now. The present moment is the fresh bucket of water you hold in your hands, but you cannot drink from it because you are shackled to the memory of your past mistake. These are the unseen chains. They are not made of iron or steel. They are forged from thought. They are made of regret, of shame, of the endless story of I should have done differently. Master Jinsei picked up his brush again. With a single, fluid stroke, he drew an enso, a perfect circle, on the rice paper. It was a symbol of emptiness, of wholeness, of the universe. The circle was not quite closed, leaving a small gap. The past is not a fixed entity, he said, pointing to the circle with his brush. It is a story, and because it is a story, it can be retold, or it can be seen for what it is, just a story, a collection of thoughts and images that you are choosing to believe in this very moment. He explained further, his voice a soothing balm on Kaito's raw spirit. He spoke of how every act of self-judgment was another link added to the chain. Every sleepless night spent ruminating was a tightening of its grip. Every time Kaito felt unworthy during a meal or a chant, he was polishing the chain, making it stronger, heavier. The original event, the unkindness to his sister, was the first, small link. But the true weight, the crushing burden he felt now, was composed almost entirely of the thousands upon thousands of links he himself had added since. Your mistake was a moment, the abbot concluded, his gaze full of a profound, unwavering compassion. Your suffering has been years. The first was a cause, the second is an effect, that you continue to cause right now. You are not chained to your past, Kaito. You are chained to your relationship with your past. And that is a profound difference. Because while you cannot change what has been, you can, with practice, change how you hold it. You can learn to loosen your grip. Kaito looked up, his eyes meeting the abbot's. He did not feel healed, not yet. The stone was still there, the weight still palpable. But for the first time, he felt a subtle shift in his understanding. He had always seen his guilt as a solid, unchangeable fact, a punishment he had to endure. He had never considered that it was an active process, a habit of the mind that he was perpetuating. The chains were not forged by a distant, angry God or an unforgiving universe. They were forged by his own mind. And if his mind had the power to create them, then perhaps, just perhaps, it also had the power to let them go. He left the abbot's study not with a sense of relief, but with a fragile, flickering sense of possibility. The path ahead was still shrouded in mist, but for the first time in years, a tiny pinpoint of light seemed to shine through. The chains were still there, heavy and cold around his heart, but now he could see them. He could see them for what they were. And that, he was beginning to understand, was the first essential step toward freedom. That evening, as Kaito sat in the zendo for the final meditation of the day, the abbot's words echoed in his mind. You are chained to your relationship with your past. He tried to focus on his breath, but the image of the chain was vivid, almost tangible. He could feel its cold, metallic weight, not just in his chest, but wrapped around his entire being. He saw it as a physical thing, each link glowing with the dull, dark light of a specific memory of self-recrimination. There was a link for every time he had flinched at the sight of a young girl in the village who reminded him of his sister. There was a link for every meal he had eaten while feeling unworthy, a link for every failed attempt at meditation, for every night spent staring into the darkness. The chain was long, intricate, and terrifyingly strong. It was a masterpiece of suffering, crafted by his own hand. The abbot's analogy of the footprint in the sand returned to him.
He saw himself on a vast, empty beach. In the distance, the ocean of the present moment ebbed and flowed, its rhythm calm and steady. But he was not looking at the ocean. His back was turned to it. He was on his knees, frantically digging in the wet sand, his fingers raw, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was trying to perfectly recreate the shape of a single footprint that had been washed away long ago. He was so absorbed in this desperate, pointless task that he didn't notice the warmth of the sun on his back, or the cool breeze coming off the water, or the sound of the gulls crying overhead. He was oblivious to the entire living world around him, trapped in a self-imposed prison of memory and recreation. This new perspective was unsettling, but it was also profoundly different from his usual despair. Before, his suffering had felt like a passive state, a condition that had been inflicted upon him. Now, he was beginning to see it as an active, ongoing process. The pain was not a noun, but a verb. It was something he was doing, not something he had. After the final bell rang, signaling the end of meditation and the beginning of the great silence of the night, Kaito did not go straight to his cell. He found himself walking toward the small, secluded garden behind the kitchen, a place where the monastery's herbs were grown. He sat on a smooth, flat stone that was still warm from the last of the day's sun. The air was fragrant with the sharp, clean scent of mint and the earthy aroma of thyme. He closed his eyes, not to meditate in the formal sense, but simply to sit with this new understanding. He brought the image of the chain back to his mind. Instead of pushing it away or struggling against it, he tried to simply observe it, as the abbot had observed him in the tea room. He examined a single link. It was forged from the thought, "I was a bad brother." He watched this thought arise in his mind. He felt the familiar clenching in his stomach that
accompanied it, the cold dread that spread through his chest. He noticed how this single thought immediately gave rise to others. She will never forgive me. I don't deserve to be happy. I am a fraud. He saw how these thoughts were not solid truths, but fleeting mental events, like clouds passing in the sky. Yet he had been treating them as gospel. He had been building his entire identity around them. He was not Kaito, the monk. He was Kaito, the bad brother. He had allowed a single action from his past to define the entirety of his present. He remembered another of the abbot's teachings, one he had heard many times but had never truly understood. The master had once held up a single grain of rice and said, "This grain of rice contains the entire universe. It contains the sun that warmed it, the rain that watered it, the earth that nourished it, and the farmer who harvested it. It is connected to everything. So are you. But when you cling to a single story about yourself, you cut yourself off from the universe. You make yourself as small as that one story." Sitting there in the herb garden, Kaito felt the truth of these words for the first time. His story of being a bad brother had become his whole world. It had colored every experience, tainted every moment of potential peace. He had been living in a self-created world that was as small and dark as a locked room, while the vast, interconnected universe was waiting just outside the door. He did not feel a sudden sense of liberation. The chains did not magically fall away. The stone did not dissolve, but the nature of his relationship with them had begun to change. He was no longer just the prisoner. He was also becoming the observer of the prison. He could see the bars. He could feel the lock, and he was starting to understand that he himself held the key. The key was not in forgetting the past or denying his mistake. The key, he was beginning to suspect,
was in changing his relationship with the present moment. He took a deep breath, and for the first time, it felt a little less constricted. He drew in the scent of the mint and the damp earth. He felt the solidness of the stone beneath him. He heard the chirping of a cricket nearby. These were not profound, earth-shattering experiences. They were simple, ordinary sensations. But in that moment, they felt like miracles. They were real. They were happening now. And for a brief, precious instant, they were more real than the story of the footprint in the sand. He was still on the beach, but he had, for just a moment, turned his head and caught a glimpse of the vast, shimmering ocean. And it was a beginning. Part 3. The courage to sit with the wound. The fragile sense of possibility that had flickered within Kaito the night before did not vanish with the morning mist. It remained, a small, warm ember in the cold landscape of his heart. It was not hope, not yet. It was something quieter, more fundamental, a question. If his suffering was a process, a habit of the mind, then how could he begin to form a new one? The intellectual understanding was a map, but he did not know how to take the first step on the territory it described. After the morning's work period, a time Kaito spent weeding the vegetable garden with a newfound tentative mindfulness, he sought out Master Jinsei. He found the abbot sitting on the ingawa, the polished wooden veranda that overlooked the monastery's main courtyard. The master was not meditating or reading. He was simply sitting, watching a line of ants carry tiny fragments of a leaf across the weathered planks. His presence was so complete, so settled, that he seemed to have become a part of the scene itself, no different from the old stone lantern or the gnarled pine tree that stood sentinel in the courtyard. Kaito approached quietly and bowed low. Master. Master Jinsei did not turn his head, but his voice was warm. The ants are very determined, are they not? They do not question their task. They do not worry if they are carrying their burden correctly. They simply carry it, one step at a time. He finally turned his gaze to Kaito, his eyes holding a gentle, knowing light. You have a question. Yes, Master, Kaito said, his voice quiet. You have shown me the chain. You have shown me that I am the one who forges it. But my mind is a frantic blacksmith. It works all day and all night, adding new links. I do not know how to make it stop. The abbot gestured to the empty space beside him on the veranda. Kaito sat, arranging his robes, his posture still holding a trace of his habitual tension. You cannot force the blacksmith to stop, Master Jinsei said calmly. If you fight him, you will only make him stronger. He thrives on struggle. The more you resist his work, the hotter his forge will burn. The instruction is not to stop him. The instruction is to watch him. He paused, letting the simple, radical idea settle. For years, you have been running from the pain. When the stone in your chest makes its presence known, you try to distract yourself with chanting. You try to push it away with hard work. You try to reason it away with philosophy. At night, when you cannot escape, you curl up around it, bracing yourself against it. You have done everything except the one thing that is required. What is that, Master? Kaito asked, his heart beating a little faster. You have never truly looked at it. You have never simply sat with the wound and allowed it to be, without judgment, without a story, without a desperate need for it to be different. The abbot's gaze was steady and full of compassion. The first step toward healing is not to run, or to fight, or to fix. It is the simple and most difficult act of stillness. It is the courage to sit with what is. His instruction was clear. Go to the zendo now while it is empty. Do not take your
Counting beads. Do not focus on the breath in the usual way. Simply take your seat. And when the feelings arise, the guilt, the shame, the memory, the heavy stone, do not turn away. Do not push them down. Do not analyze them. Just let them be there. Greet them as you would greet a visitor at the monastery gate. You do not have to serve them tea, but you must not slam the gate in their face. Simply acknowledge their presence. Watch them, feel them, and see what happens when you stop fighting. Kaito bowed, his mind a mix of fear and resolve. The idea of intentionally inviting the pain he had spent years trying to avoid was terrifying. It felt like walking willingly into a burning house. But the abbot's words held the clear, resonant ring of truth. Every other path had led him deeper into the labyrinth. This was the one path he had not yet tried. He walked to the meditation hall. In the middle of the day, it was deserted. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, golden insects. The hall, usually filled with the collective energy of the monks, was now a vast vessel of silence. Kaito felt small and exposed as he walked to his usual cushion. He settled into his posture, the familiar ache in his knees a grounding sensation. He straightened his back and rested his hands in his lap. He closed his eyes. For the first few minutes, his mind was a whirlwind. This is a mistake. This will only make it worse. I should be sweeping the paths. I should be copying sutras. The blacksmith was hard at work, trying to distract him, to pull him away from this quiet, terrifying task. Kaito remembered the abbot's words. Just watch him. He did not engage with the thoughts. He simply noted them. Ah, the thought to sweep the paths. Ah, the fear that this will make it worse. Then, as if sensing it was being invited, the feeling began to arise. It started not as a thought, but as a physical sensation. A familiar coldness began to pool in the center of his chest, a deep, internal chill. Then came the weight, the sensation of a smooth, heavy river stone pressing down on his sternum, making his breath shallow and tight. This was the stone. This was his wound. His immediate, ingrained instinct was to recoil, to clench his muscles, to start counting his breath, anything to create distance. But the instruction was clear. Do not turn away. He held his posture. He relaxed his shoulders, which had crept up toward his ears. He consciously softened the muscles in his stomach, which had tightened into a hard knot. He turned his full, gentle attention toward the sensation in his chest. He did not try to name it. He did not call it guilt. He simply explored its raw, physical properties. It was cold. It was heavy. It had a distinct location just behind his breastbone. It seemed to have a radiating quality, a coldness that seeped outward into his ribs. His breath was shallow because it seemed to. Hit a wall when he tried to inhale deeply. The wall of the stone itself. As he stayed with the physical sensation, the emotional and mental layers began to appear. The image of his sister's face, her eyes welling with tears, flashed behind his eyelids, sharp and clear. With the image came a powerful wave of shame, so intense it felt like a hot flush spreading up his neck and across his face. He could feel his cheeks burning. His first impulse was to think, I am so ashamed. I am a terrible person. This was the story, the narrative that gave the shame its power. But he remembered the abbot's guidance. Watch it. Don't analyze it.
He tried a new approach. He separated the story from the sensation. He noted the thought, "I am a terrible person," and then let it go, like a leaf floating down a stream. He returned his attention to the raw feeling of the heat in his face. He just felt it, without adding a second layer of judgment about it. He observed the heat, its intensity, how it seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. He was not Kaito feeling ashamed. He was awareness, watching the phenomenon of heat arise in the body. It was the hardest work he had ever done. His mind fought him at every turn. The blacksmith was furious, hammering away, throwing every tool he had at Kaito. Memories, accusations, fears. "You will be stuck like this forever. You are broken. Master Jinsei is wrong. This is just self-torture." Each thought was a dark cloud that threatened to block out the sun. Kaito recalled another teaching. The mind is like a clear blue sky, and thoughts and feelings are merely clouds passing through. You are not the clouds. You are the sky. He began to use this image. A dark, heavy cloud of regret drifted in. He watched it. He acknowledged its presence. Ah, the cloud of regret. He did not try to blow it away. He did not curse it for being there. He simply allowed it to occupy the sky of his awareness. And he noticed something extraordinary. When he did not fight it, when he did not feed it with more stories and judgments, the cloud did not stay forever. It slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to change its shape. Its edges softened, and eventually it drifted on, revealing the blue sky behind it. Then another cloud would appear, a jagged gray cloud of self-pity, a thin, wispy cloud of anxiety about the future. He practiced again and again. Acknowledge, observe, let it be, let it pass. He sat for what felt like an eternity. He lost all track of time. The sunlight streaming through the window shifted, moving slowly across the wooden floor. At one point, the pain and grief became so intense that his body began to shake. Tears streamed from his closed eyes, not hot tears of shame, but cool tears of release. He did not wipe them away. He simply allowed the sensation of the tears to be another object of his observation. He felt the wetness on his cheeks, the slight tremor in his jaw. He was not a crying man. He was awareness, watching.
The phenomenon of crying. In the midst of this deep, unwavering observation, something began to loosen. The stone in his chest did not disappear, but its density seemed to change. It felt less like solid granite and more like tightly packed ice. There was still a coldness, a weight, but he could sense a subtle space around it, a feeling that it was not fused to his very being. It was an object in his awareness, not the entirety of his awareness. The chains, for the first time, felt a little less tight. A single link seemed to have relaxed its grip. When the deep, resonant sound of the afternoon bell echoed through the monastery, it startled him. He had been sitting for over an hour. He slowly, stiffly, uncrossed his legs. His body was sore, and he felt utterly drained, as if he had just finished a long and arduous journey. But it was a clean exhaustion, a profound weariness that was free of the usual frantic, anxious energy. He opened his eyes. The zendo looked different. The light seemed softer, the shadows deeper and more peaceful. The scent of the old wood was richer. It was the same room, but his perception of it had shifted. By daring to look inward with such unflinching honesty, he had subtly changed his ability to see what was outward.
He stood up and walked toward the exit. As he passed the open doorway, he saw Master Jinsei standing in the courtyard, trimming a bonsai tree with a pair of small, delicate shears. The abbot looked up, and their eyes met. He offered no words of praise, no questions about what had happened. He simply gave Kaito a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod of acknowledgement, of understanding. It said, "The work has begun." Kaito bowed in return, a deep, grateful bow that came from a place of newfound stillness. The stone was still there, the wound was still tender, but he had sat with it. He had not run, he had not fought. He had found the courage to simply be present with his own pain. And in that quiet, courageous act of stillness, the first true breath of healing had finally been taken. Walking away from the zendo, Kaito felt as though he were moving through water. His limbs were heavy, his mind quieted to a low hum. The usual internal chatter, the relentless voice of the blacksmith, was for the moment silent, seemingly exhausted by his steadfast refusal to engage in battle. He made his way to the kitchens for his afternoon duties, which today involved washing the large pots and bowls from the midday meal. Ordinarily, this was a task he performed on autopilot, his mind far away, lost in the familiar labyrinth of regret. He would scrub the blackened pots with a fierce, punishing energy, as if trying to scour away his own internal stains. But today was different. He filled the large wooden basin with hot water from the kettle on the hearth. Steam rose in a fragrant cloud, carrying the scent of wood smoke and wet earth. He picked up the first pot, a heavy iron vessel used for cooking rice porridge.
He looked at it, really looked at it. He noticed the way the light reflected off its dark, seasoned surface. He felt its substantial weight in his hands. He plunged it into the hot water and began to scrub, not with frantic energy, but with a slow, deliberate attention. He focused on the sensation of the rough brush against the smooth metal, the sound of the water sloshing in the basin, the feeling of the heat seeping into his hands. His mind, as was its habit, began to drift. The image of the cooking pot, a vessel of nourishment for the community, triggered a familiar pang of unworthiness. The thought arose, I do not deserve to clean something so useful, so pure. This was a well-worn path, a familiar link in the chain, but now he had a new tool. He did not follow the thought down its dark alleyway. He acknowledged it, as he had in the zendo. Ah, the thought of unworthiness. He let it be there, a cloud in the sky of his mind, and then he gently, without force, returned his attention to the pot in his hands. He focused on the physical act of cleaning. He scrubbed the inside, feeling the slightly sticky residue of the rice porridge give way under the bristles of the brush. He turned the pot over and cleaned the bottom, blackened and hardened by countless encounters with the fire. He saw this blackness, not as a stain to be violently removed, but simply as a fact, a record of the pot's purpose. It was a sign of its service. He rinsed the pot in a second basin of cool, clear water, watching as the last of the soap and grime swirled away, leaving the dark metal clean and gleaming. He placed the pot on a wooden rack to dry and picked up the next one. He continued this way for the better part of an hour, washing bowls,
ladles, and cutting boards. Each time his mind wandered into the past, into the story of his guilt, he practiced the same gentle return. Acknowledge the thought, let it be. Return to the sensation of the water, the wood, the metal. It was a revelation. He was discovering that mindfulness was not something reserved for the meditation cushion. It was a practice that could be brought into the most mundane moments of life. The simple, repetitive task of washing dishes became a profound training ground. It was a moving meditation, a continuous opportunity to notice the habits of his mind and to choose, again and again, to come back to the present reality. He found a certain beauty in the work he had previously despised. He saw the subtle patterns in the grain of the wooden bowls, the elegant curve of a bamboo ladle. He felt a quiet sense of connection to the monks who had used these items, to the cooks who had prepared the food, to the entire intricate web of monastery life. For a fleeting moment, the feeling of being an outsider, a fraud, dissolved. He was not Kaito the unworthy. He was simply a pair of hands washing a bowl, a part of the flow of the day, as natural and necessary as the ants the abbot had been watching. When he finished, he dried his hands on a rough cotton cloth and stepped outside into the late afternoon sun. The air was beginning to cool, and the shadows were growing long. He felt a deep sense of peace, not the ecstatic, blissful peace he had once imagined enlightenment to be, but something far more ordinary and accessible. It was the simple peace of a quiet mind, the peace of being fully where he was. He knew this state was not permanent. The blacksmith was not gone forever. He was merely resting. The clouds would surely gather again. The stone had not vanished. Its icy presence was still there if he chose to focus on it. But something fundamental had shifted. He had learned that he did not have to be a victim of his own mind. He had discovered that he possessed a capacity for stillness, a quiet inner space that could hold even the most painful feelings without being destroyed by them. He had spent years believing that the only way to deal with his wound was to get rid of it, to excise it from his heart like a surgeon removing a tumor. Now he was beginning to understand a different kind of healing. It was not about removal, but about expansion. It was about creating a space of awareness around the wound that was so vast, so compassionate, so unconditionally accepting that the wound was no longer the defining feature of the landscape. It was just one part of a much larger, richer whole. The sky could hold the darkest storm cloud and still remain the sky. His heart, he was starting to believe, could learn to do the same. This was the courage he had found. Not the courage to defeat his pain, but the courage to hold it. Part 4. The River of Impermanence. In the days that followed Kaito's breakthrough in the Zendo, a new quality of attention began to permeate his life. The practice of sitting with his wound had not magically erased it, but it had fundamentally altered his relationship to it. The stone in his chest was still there, a familiar presence, but it no longer dominated his inner world. It was like a large, dark boulder in the middle of a field. Before, he had spent all his time and energy trying to push the boulder, to break it, or to hide it. Now, he was learning to simply let it be, and in doing so, he was discovering the rest of the field. He was noticing the wildflowers growing at its base, the way the sun warmed its surface, the vastness of the sky above it. Master Jinsei, with his quiet, penetrating wisdom, observed this subtle shift in his student. He saw the tension in Kaito's shoulders begin to soften. He noticed a new steadiness in Kaito's hands during the tea ceremony. He heard a deeper resonance in Kaito's voice during the morning chants. The young monk was no longer fighting a war. A truce had been declared, and in the quiet space of that truce, something new had a chance to grow. One morning,
After the silent breakfast, the abbot approached Kaito as he was putting away his bowls. "Today, your work will be different," he said, his voice calm and clear. "Leave the sweeping and the chopping to the others. I want you to go down to the river that runs behind the monastery. Take a cushion with you. Your task for the day is simple. Watch the water. Do not try to meditate. Do not try to achieve anything. Just watch." Kaito was puzzled by the instruction, but he had learned to trust the abbot's unconventional methods. He bowed in acknowledgement, fetched his meditation cushion, and made his way down the well-worn path that led through a grove of whispering bamboo trees to the riverbank. The river was not wide, but it was swift and full, fed by the snows that still clung to the peaks of the distant mountains. Its water was the color of pale jade, clear enough that he could see the smooth, multicolored stones that formed its bed. The air here was cooler than in the monastery courtyard, filled with the clean, damp scent of moss and wet earth, and the constant, soothing sound of the moving water. It was a sound that was both energetic and peaceful, a ceaseless murmur that seemed to absorb all other noises. Kaito found a spot on a flat, moss-covered rock that jutted out over the water, placing his cushion upon it. He settled into a comfortable sitting posture, his legs crossed loosely in front of him. He remembered the abbot's words, "Just watch." He let his gaze rest softly on the surface of the river. At first, his mind was busy. It tried to label and categorize what he was seeing. There is a patch of sunlight on the water. A leaf is floating by. The water is moving quickly. He noticed this habit of the mind, the incessant need to narrate experience rather than simply have it. He gently let go of the labels and tried to see the river more directly. He began to notice the incredible complexity of the water's movement. It was not a single uniform flow. It was a dance of 1,000 different currents and eddies. In the center, the main current moved with a powerful, determined surge. Closer to the banks, the water swirled and turned back on itself, creating small, gentle whirlpools where foam and fallen petals gathered. He saw how the water flowed around a large, half-submerged rock, splitting into two streams that rejoined on the other side as if they had never been parted. He saw the play of light on the surface, a shimmering, ever-changing pattern of silver and gold that was impossible to grasp. He sat for a long time, his awareness sinking deeper and deeper into the flow of the river. The sound of the water, which had at first been a background noise, became the very fabric of his attention. He felt its rhythm in his own body, a gentle, rocking sensation that seemed to soothe the tight knot of anxiety he had carried for so long. As he watched, a profound teaching began to dawn on him, not as an intellectual concept, but as a felt reality. The river was a perfect illustration of anicca, the principle
of impermanence, one of the fundamental truths of the Buddha's teaching. Everything was in constant motion. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was permanent. He looked at a specific point in the river, a place where the sunlight was particularly bright. The water that was in that spot now was gone in the next instant, already downstream, replaced by new water that was, in its turn, immediately swept away. The river was always the same river, yet the water that composed it was never the same water. It was a perfect paradox, a constant presence made entirely of change. This realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He thought of himself. He thought of the Kaito who had stood on the bridge all those years ago, the arrogant, impatient young man who had spoken such cruel words to his sister. He had been holding on to that version of himself as if it were a solid, permanent statue. He had defined his entire present self by the actions of that past self. But where was that young man now? The cells in his body had all been replaced many times over. The thoughts and beliefs he held then were different from the ones he held now. His experiences had shaped him, changed him. The Kaito who sat on this rock, watching this river, was not the same person who had left the village. He was as different from that person as the water flowing past him now was from the water that had flowed past this same spot an hour ago. He had been punishing his present self for the crimes of a person who no longer existed. The stone in his chest, the heavy weight of his guilt, suddenly felt different. He had always experienced it as a solid, unchanging object. But what if it too was impermanent? What if the stone was not a stone at all, but a frozen river, a part of his own life energy that had become stuck, solidified by his relentless focus on the past? He had been holding his own heart in a state of suspended animation, refusing to let it flow and change with the rest of life. He saw that his guilt was not a thing, but an activity. It was the act of remembering, the act of judging, the act of telling a story. And like the river, this activity was made up of countless individual moments, a thought of regret, a feeling of shame, a physical clenching in his chest. Each of these was a single drop of water in the river of his suffering, and he had been creating this river, moment by moment, by continuously feeding it with his attention. A dragonfly with iridescent blue wings landed on a reed near his rock. It rested for a moment, its delicate wings quivering in the sunlight, and then it was gone. A cloud passed overhead, its shadow sliding across the surface of the water, momentarily dimming the bright jade to a deep, mysterious green. Then the sun returned. Everything was in flux. The dragonfly, the cloud, the light, the water, and him. He, too, was a part of this flow. He thought of his sister Emmy. He had held the image of her tear-streaked face in his mind as
A static photograph. But she was not a photograph. She, too, was a river. In the years since he had left, she would have grown and changed. She would have experienced her own joys and sorrows. She would have loved and perhaps been hurt. She would have become a woman. The young girl on the bridge no longer existed, any more than the young man who had hurt her. He had been interacting not with his sister, but with a ghost. A memory he had kept locked in the prison of his own mind. This did not absolve him of his past actions. The seed of his unkindness had been planted, and it had undoubtedly borne fruit. But his current suffering was not healing that past hurt. It was simply creating new suffering for himself in the present. His guilt was not helping his sister. It was not making him a better monk. It was just a heavy, useless stone that was preventing him from being fully alive, fully present, fully capable of offering compassion to anyone, including himself. He stayed by the river all day. He did not eat. He did not move from his cushion except to stretch his stiff legs. He simply watched. He watched the light change as the sun arched across the sky. He watched the shadows of the bamboo trees lengthen and stretch across the water. He watched as the vibrant green of the afternoon faded into the soft blues and purples of twilight. As darkness began to fall, the world became more about sound than sight. The constant murmur of the river seemed to grow louder, more intimate in the cool night air. He could hear the chirping of crickets and the deep, resonant croak of a bullfrog. He felt, rather than saw, the ceaseless flow of the water just a few feet away from him. In that deep, enveloping darkness, a profound sense of peace settled over him. It was the peace of acceptance. He could not change the past any more than he could stop the river from flowing to the sea. But he did not have to be defined by it. He did not have to remain frozen on its banks. He could choose to step into the current of the present moment, to flow with the ceaseless change that was the nature of life itself. He understood now that self-forgiveness was not about deciding that what he did was okay.
It was about recognizing that the person who did it is gone. It was about letting go of the illusion of a fixed, permanent self that is to be blamed or punished. It was about embracing the fluid, ever-changing reality of his own being. When he finally rose to his feet in the near-total darkness, his legs numb and tingling, the stone in his chest felt lighter than it had in years. It was still there, but it felt porous, less dense. It felt as though the river he had been watching all day had found a way to flow through it, creating small channels, loosening its solid grip. He walked back to the monastery under a canopy of brilliant stars. The path was dark, but he knew it by heart. He did not need to see. He could feel his way. And for the first time, he felt that perhaps he
could learn to feel his way through the darkness in his own heart, too. He was not a fixed, guilty person. He was a river. And a river's nature is to flow, to move, to change, and ultimately to merge with the vast, open sea. Returning to his cell that night, Kaito felt a quiet transformation had taken place. The profound, day-long immersion in the river's teaching had washed over him, cleansing not the memory of his mistake, but the rigid, calcified way he had held it. Sleep came more easily than it had in years. It was not the deep, dreamless void he had often craved as an escape, but a gentle restorative rest, like a boat settling into a calm harbor after a long and turbulent journey. He dreamt of flowing water, of smooth stones, and of a light that shimmered and danced, never staying in one place. He awoke before the morning bell, not with a jolt of anxiety, but with a sense of quiet clarity. The stone in his chest was still perceptible, but its character had changed. It no longer felt like a foreign object, an invasive weight. It felt more like a part of his own geology, a smooth, worn stone that had been part of the riverbed of his life for so long that the water had learned to flow around it, and even through it. Its sharp, painful edges had been softened by the current of impermanence. Over the next few weeks, Kaito continued his practice with a renewed sense of purpose, but it was a purpose free from the desperate striving that had characterized his efforts before. His meditation was no longer a battle to silence his mind, but an opportunity to observe its ever-changing flow. When the familiar thoughts of guilt and shame arose, he saw them not as his personal failings, but as eddies in the stream of his consciousness. He would acknowledge them with a quiet mental nod, "Ah, the eddy of regret," and then gently return his focus to the main current of his breath. He saw that these eddies were not permanent fixtures. If he did not feed them with the energy of his attention, they would naturally lose their momentum and dissolve back into the larger flow. His work in the monastery also became a continuation of the river's lesson. When he swept the gravel in the rock garden, he was no longer trying to impose a perfect, static order. Instead, he saw the act of sweeping as a participation in a constant process of change. He would create the beautiful flowing patterns, knowing full well that by the next day, a fallen leaf, a gust of wind, or the tracks of a stray cat would have altered them. The garden's beauty was not in its permanence, but in its constant, graceful renewal. His sweeping was not an end in itself, but a single mindful moment in an endless dance of creation and dissolution. He began to see impermanence everywhere. He saw it in the slow, deliberate unfurling of a fern frond in the damp, shady corner of the courtyard. He saw it in the way the morning glories that climbed the kitchen wall would bloom with breathtaking vibrancy at dawn and be withered and spent by dusk. He saw it in the changing face of the moon, from a delicate sliver to a brilliant full orb, and back again to darkness. He saw it in the aging faces of the older monks, their skin a beautiful map of the years that had flowed through them. This constant, gentle reminder of anicca began to dismantle the very foundation of his guilt.
His guilt had been built on the illusion that the past was a fixed, solid place, and that he was a fixed, solid person, forever stained by it. But the universe was showing him, in 1,000 different ways every day, that nothing was fixed. Everything was a process, a flow, a dance. One afternoon, while he was helping to mend the monastery's thatched roof, he paused and looked out over the valley. He could see the small, winding road that led back toward his village. For a moment, the old, familiar pang of sadness and regret arose. The image of his sister's face, frozen in time, came to him. But this time, he met the image differently. He held it in his awareness, but he also held the awareness of the river. He imagined his sister Emmy not as the girl on the bridge, but as a river herself. He imagined the flow of her life in the years since he had left, the laughter, the tears, the friendships, the challenges, the moments of simple, ordinary happiness. He realized that in his self-absorbed guilt, he had denied her this. He had denied her the reality of her own life, her own journey. He had kept her a prisoner in his memory, just as he had kept himself a prisoner. A profound sense of compassion arose in him, a compassion that was not tinged with the bitterness of his own guilt. It was a clear, simple wish for her well-being. He hoped her river was flowing freely. He hoped she had found happiness. He wished, with all his heart, that the small stone of his unkindness had been just one of many stones in her riverbed, one that the current of her life had long since smoothed over and worn down. He realized that the greatest act of love he could offer her now was not to continue punishing himself. It was to free himself from the past, so that he could be fully present and compassionate in the world now. By clinging to his guilt, he was perpetuating a cycle of suffering that helped no one. By learning to let go, by learning to flow with the river of his own life, he could perhaps become a source of peace rather than a vessel of pain. He looked down at his hands, calloused and strong from his work. They were not the hands of the arrogant boy who had left home. They were the hands of a man who was learning, slowly and humbly, to live in the world as it is. He took a deep breath of the clear mountain air. The stone in his chest was still there, a quiet, deep memory. But it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a reminder of the precious, fleeting, and ever-changing nature of life. A reminder to be kind, to be present, to be awake, because this moment, like the water in the river, would never come again. Part 5. The Parable of the Second Arrow. Kaito's newfound understanding of impermanence was a profound anchor. It did not stop the storms of his mind, but it gave him a place of refuge from which to watch them. He began to see his thoughts and feelings not as absolute truths, but as weather patterns, temporary, impersonal, and ultimately not the whole of the sky. He could experience a sudden squall of regret or a chilling fog of shame, but he no longer identified with it. He knew that, if he was patient, the sun of his own quiet awareness would eventually shine through again. This practice brought a measure of peace he had not known was possible. Yet, there were times when the old habits of mind proved to be incredibly powerful, like a river that, despite being redirected, still tries to flow back into its old, deeply carved channel. One afternoon, Kaito was in the monastery's small library, carefully repairing the binding of an ancient sutra. It was delicate work that required his full attention. The scent of old paper and dry ink filled the air, and the only sound was the soft rustle of the pages. He was feeling calm, present, and absorbed in his task. Through the open doorway, he saw one of the youngest novices, a boy named Ren, receive a small, cloth-wrapped package from a visiting traveler. Ren's face lit up with a joy so pure and radiant it seemed to illuminate the entire courtyard. He bowed deeply to the traveler and then hurried to a quiet corner, where he carefully unwrapped his gift. Inside was a handful of sweet rice cakes, a type Kaito knew was a specialty from the boy's home province. Ren took a small bite, and a look of profound, homesick happiness washed over him. He closed his eyes, savoring the taste of home. Watching this simple, innocent scene, Kaito felt an unexpected and powerful jolt. It was as if a dormant nerve had been struck. The familiar coldness bloomed in his chest, and his breath became shallow. The image of his sister, Emmy, rose in his mind, not as a flowing river, but as the old, static photograph of a sad and wounded child. The thought came, sharp and swift as a needle. You denied your family this simple joy. You chose your own pride over their love. You are not like this boy. You do not deserve such simple happiness. The old story began to play, its power undiminished. He felt the weight of the stone, the tightness in his throat. He tried to apply his new understanding. He told himself, "This is impermanent. This feeling will pass." The boy on the bridge is gone. But the thoughts were sticky, insistent. The emotional charge was so strong that it overwhelmed his fragile new perspective. He felt himself being pulled back into the old whirlpool, its current strong and treacherous. He felt a wave of despair. Had he learned nothing? Was he doomed to be caught in this loop forever? He
Finished his work on the sutra, his hands now feeling clumsy, his mind agitated. He knew he needed guidance. He found Master Jinsei on the western veranda, watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the mountains. The sky was a canvas of pale orange and soft violet. The abbot did not seem to be doing anything, yet his stillness was so profound it felt like an activity in itself. Kaito bowed. "Master, may I speak?" "You are already speaking, Kaito," the abbot said gently, without turning. "Your posture speaks of a storm. Your breath speaks of a struggle. Your silence speaks of a question. Sit." Kaito sat beside him. For a long while, they simply watched the colors of the sky deepen. The quiet, expansive beauty had a calming effect, and the frantic energy in Kaito's chest began to subside, leaving behind a dull, familiar ache. "Master," Kaito began, his voice low, "I have been watching the river as you taught. I see that everything changes. I see that the person I was is gone. I understand this in my mind. But today, my heart forgot. A small thing happened, and the old pain returned with such force. It felt as if I had made no progress at all. I understand that the past is gone, but I do not understand why I continue to use it to hurt myself now." Master Jinsei turned his head and looked at Kaito, his gaze clear and compassionate. "You have learned a very important lesson. You have learned that understanding is not enough. The mind can grasp a truth, but the heart has its own deep habits. You have seen that you are hurting yourself, but you do not yet see the mechanism. You are like a man who keeps walking into a wall in the dark. You know you are bruised, but you do not see the wall itself." He picked up a small dry twig that had fallen onto the veranda. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "It is from the teachings of the Buddha himself. Imagine a man is walking through a forest.
Suddenly, without warning, he is struck by an arrow. He feels a sharp, searing pain. It is a terrible, shocking event. This is unavoidable. This is the first arrow. He held the twig up. The pain is real. The wound is real. This is the nature of life. We cannot go through the forest of existence without at some point being struck by an arrow. It might be the arrow of sickness, or the arrow of loss, or the arrow of another's unkind words. Or it might be the arrow of our own mistake. This first arrow is the pain that is inherent to life. It is what we call suffering, but it is more accurately described as simple, clean pain. He then broke the twig in two. He held up one of the sharp, pointed pieces. But what does the man do next? Does he tend to his wound? No. In his shock and anger, he cries out, "Why me? What did I do to deserve this? This is terrible. I will never recover from this." And as he is consumed by these thoughts, he takes out a second arrow and stabs himself with it in the very same spot.
He looked at Kaito intently. This second arrow is not made of wood and feathers. It is made of our reaction to the first. It is made of judgment, of blame, of self-pity, of fear, of rumination. The first arrow causes pain. The second arrow causes suffering. The wound from the second arrow is often far deeper and poisons the body and mind far more than the wound from the first. The abbot's words fell into the quiet air like stones into a deep pool. Kaito felt a profound sense of recognition. He saw his own life laid bare in this simple parable. "Your unkind words to your sister on the bridge," Master Jinsei continued softly. "That was a first arrow. It was a mistake. It caused pain, for her and for you. It happened. It flew from the bow and it struck its mark. That arrow fell to the ground years ago. Its shaft has long since rotted away. But then, Kaito, you picked up another bow, and you have been firing second arrows into yourself ever since. Every time you have called yourself a bad brother, you have fired a second arrow. Every time you have told yourself you are unworthy of peace, you have fired a second arrow. Every sleepless night you have spent replaying the memory. Every meal you have eaten with a heart full of shame. Every moment of joy you have denied yourself. Each of these has been another arrow, fired by your own hand into the original wound." The image was so clear, so precise, that Kaito could almost feel it. The stone in his chest was not a stone at all. It was a wound, kept raw and inflamed by thousands of self-inflicted injuries. He had been the archer and the target, locked in a tragic, solitary battle. "The first arrow is unavoidable," the abbot said, his voice becoming even more gentle. "We are all struck by them. Even the Buddha was struck by first arrows. He grew old. He got sick. He was misunderstood. But the wise person, Kaito, learns not to fire the second arrow. They feel the pain of the first arrow. They acknowledge it, and then they wisely and compassionately tend to the wound. They do not add a second layer of suffering through their own thinking." Kaito looked at his own hands, resting in his lap. He had always seen them as the hands of a monk, hands for chanting, for working, for meditation. Now,
He saw them as the hands that had been holding the bow, drawing the string, and firing arrow after arrow into his own heart. The insight was devastating, but it was also profoundly liberating. His suffering was not a mysterious permanent stain on his soul. It was a habit, a terrible, deeply ingrained mental habit of self-attack, and if it was a habit, it could be changed.
You cannot go back and unfire the first arrow,
Master Jinsei said, as if reading his thoughts.
That is not possible. The practice is not about changing the past. The practice is about this moment, right now. It is about learning to recognize when your hand is reaching for that second arrow. It is about learning to see the bow of self-judgment as you begin to raise it. And it is about finding the wisdom and the strength to simply, gently put it down. A great weight seemed to lift from Kaito's shoulders. It was the weight of a battle he now realized he did not have to fight. He had been trying to win a war against himself, a war that could never be won. The path to peace was not victory, it was disarmament. He looked at the abbot, and for the first time his eyes were not clouded by the fog of his inner turmoil. They were clear. "Thank you, Master," he whispered. The words felt inadequate to express the depth of the shift that had just occurred within him. The sun had finally disappeared behind the mountains, leaving behind a sky of deep, peaceful indigo. The first star of the evening appeared, a tiny, brilliant point of light in the vast emptiness. Kaito understood. The first arrow was the past. The second arrow was the story he told himself about the past. He could not change what had happened, but he could, in this present moment, choose to tell a different story, or better yet, he could choose to tell no story at all, and simply rest in the quiet, unwounded sky of his own awareness. He had found the wall in the dark, and he had just been handed a lamp. As they sat in the deepening twilight, the parable of the two arrows continued to unfold in Kaito's mind, its simple wisdom illuminating the dark corners of his long-held suffering. He began to see the pattern everywhere, not just in his great central wound, but in the countless small frustrations and anxieties of his daily life. He thought of the morning when he had been trying to light the charcoal fire for the tea ceremony. The coals had been damp and refused to catch. He had felt a surge of frustration, a familiar tightening in his gut. That frustration was a first arrow, a simple, unavoidable pain of life. But then his mind had immediately fired a second arrow. "You are so clumsy. The other monks never have this trouble. You are failing at even the simplest task." This second arrow of self-criticism had turned a minor inconvenience into a moment of genuine suffering, reinforcing his deep-seated sense of inadequacy. He thought of a time last week when another monk had made a passing comment about his chanting being slightly off-key. The comment itself was the first arrow, a moment of mild embarrassment. But Kaito had spent the rest of the day firing second arrows. "He thinks I am a bad monk. Everyone must have noticed. I am a disgrace to this monastery." He had taken a small sharp splinter and, through his own rumination, had driven it deep into his heart. He saw now that his entire life had been a constant barrage of these self-inflicted wounds. The second arrow was his mind's default response to any form of pain, whether it was a great regret or a minor annoyance. It was a deeply ingrained habit, a mental reflex as automatic as pulling one's hand away from a hot stove. "Master," Kaito said, breaking the peaceful silence, "I see this pattern now. It is the story of my life, but the habit is so strong. My hand reaches for the second arrow before I am even aware of the first. How do I learn to pause? How do I find the space between the two arrows?" Master Jinsei nodded slowly.
his gaze fixed on the distant dark outline of the mountains. "You have already begun," he said. "The first step is to see the archer." Today, when the pain arose, you did not simply drown in it. You recognized it as the old pain. You knew it was a familiar pattern. That recognition, that moment of mindfulness, is the beginning of the pause. Awareness is the space between the arrows. He elaborated, his voice a calm and steady guide. When the first arrow strikes, the pain arises. It is a raw physical sensation, a tightness in the chest, a heat in the face, a hollowness in the stomach. This is the body's truth. Before the mind creates a story, there is just this raw feeling. The practice is to become intimate with the feeling of the first arrow, to stay with the raw sensation without immediately launching into the narrative of the second arrow. When you saw the novice with his rice cakes, the abbot continued, the first arrow was a pang of sadness, of loss. It was a pure, clean pain. If you had simply stayed with that sensation, acknowledging it with kindness, this is sadness. This is what loss feels like in the body. It would have arisen, stayed for a time, and then passed, like any other sensation. But your mind, in its habit, immediately jumped in with its story. You are a bad person. You don't deserve happiness. That story was the second arrow. It took the clean pain of sadness and turned it into the toxic suffering of guilt and shame. Kaito closed his eyes, replaying the scene in his mind, but this time with the abbot's guidance as a map. He recalled the initial jolt, the sudden coldness in his chest. He saw that it had been just a sensation, pure and simple. It was he who had supplied the meaning, the judgment, the condemnation. He had been the one who had poisoned the wound. "So, the practice is to catch myself?" Kaito asked. "To notice when I am reaching for the bow?" "Precisely," said the abbot. "In the beginning you will not be successful. The habit is too strong. You will be struck by the first arrow, and you will fire the second before you even realize it. You will find yourself in the middle of the familiar suffering. Do not be discouraged. This is part of the path. When you realize what has happened, do not fire a third arrow by blaming yourself for firing the second. Do not think, 'Oh, I am a terrible meditator. I failed again.' That is just another arrow." Instead, he said, his voice softening, "The moment you realize you have shot the second arrow, simply acknowledge it with compassion. Say to yourself, 'There is the second arrow. I see it now.' And then, with great gentleness, put the bow down. Turn your attention back to the original wound. Feel the pain of both arrows now, but without adding any more. This is a practice of kindness. You are learning to be a good friend to yourself, even when you are in pain." Kaito felt a profound sense of relief. The path was not about achieving a perfect state of never being hurt. It was about changing his response to being hurt. It was not about becoming invincible. It was about becoming kind. He understood that this was not a quick fix. It was the work of a lifetime. It was a moment-by-moment practice of mindfulness and compassion. It was learning to soothe his own wounds instead of pouring salt on them. He opened his eyes and looked at the night sky, now filled with 1,000 glittering stars. Each star was a distant sun, a point of light in an immense darkness. He felt a connection to that image. His awareness, his ability to see the arrows, was a small point of light. His habitual suffering was the vast darkness. But a single lamp, as the abbot had said, can illuminate a large room. His small flickering lamp of mindfulness could, with practice, begin to illuminate the vast, dark chamber of his own heart. He bowed his head to the abbot, a gesture of immense gratitude. "I will practice this, Master. I will learn to put down the bow." They sat for a while longer, two small figures on a wooden veranda, held in the vast, silent embrace of the night. The war inside Kaito was not over, but the terms of engagement had changed forever. He was no longer a soldier, but a medic. His new task was not to fight, but to heal. And the first step of healing was the most radical act of all, to stop deliberately wounding himself. Part 6. The Seed of Self-Compassion. The parable of the second arrow became the central koan of Kaito's life. It was a simple, elegant key that unlocked the complex mechanism of his suffering. With this key, he began the patient, moment-by-moment work of disarming himself. The practice was not easy. The habit of a lifetime, the reflexive drawing of the bow, was a current that ran deep and strong. In the Zendo, when his leg would fall asleep and send sharp, shooting pains up his thigh, the first arrow, he would watch his mind instantly reach for the second. "You are not sitting correctly. You are a poor monk. Your body is undisciplined." He would see the bow being raised, and with a gentle, mental breath, he would practice putting it down. He would turn his attention back to the raw sensation of the pain in his leg, observing its tingling, burning quality, without the added layer of judgment. When he made a mistake in the kitchen, dropping a bowl and chipping its delicate rim, the first arrow, he would feel the hot flush of shame. He would hear the voice of the blacksmith begin to hammer, "Clumsy, worthless, you destroy beauty," and
He would practice, again, the gentle art of non-engagement. He would see the second arrow being knocked, and he would let the bowstring go slack. He would sweep up the broken pieces with a simple, focused attention, acknowledging the sadness of the broken bowl without adding the crushing weight of self-condemnation. This practice created space in his mind. The constant, grinding noise of self-criticism began to quiet down, replaced by a kind of watchful neutrality. He was no longer at war, but the battlefield was still barren. He had stopped firing arrows into the wound, but the wound itself, old and deep, remained. It was a cold, hollow place in his heart. The pain was no longer sharp and inflamed, but it had been replaced by a vast, lonely ache. Master Jinsei observed this new phase in Kaito's journey. He saw that the young monk had found stillness, but not yet warmth. He had found non-judgment, but not yet kindness. He had cleared the field of battle, but he had not yet planted any seeds. One afternoon, the abbot found Kaito sitting by the monastery's small, quiet pond, watching the carp swim in slow, graceful circles beneath the lily pads. Kaito's posture was relaxed, his face calm, but the abbot could see a subtle emptiness in his eyes, the look of a man in a house that has been swept clean but remains unfurnished. "You have become a skilled watchman, Kaito," the abbot said, his voice joining the soft hum of the dragonflies. "You see the archer before he can fire. This is a great achievement." Kaito bowed his head slightly. "I see the archer, master, but the old wound is still there. It is no longer a burning fire, but a cold stone. I can sit with it, I can observe it, but it does not heal. The field is clear, but nothing grows." "That is because you have only completed the first half of the work," Master Jinsei replied. "You have learned to stop harming yourself. Now you must learn to actively care for yourself. You have weeded the garden of your mind. Now you must learn to plant flowers." He sat down on the smooth stone next to Kaito.
For years you have practiced condemnation. It has become your most familiar habit. You have learned to stop this practice, but you have not replaced it with a new one. The heart cannot live in a vacuum. If you do not fill it with kindness, the old weeds of judgment will eventually grow back. The practice you need now is called metta. It means loving kindness. And the other is karuna. It means compassion. Kaito looked troubled. But Master, how can I offer myself loving kindness? I do not feel I deserve it. The memory of my cruelty is still real. To offer myself kindness feels like a lie. It feels like I am saying that what I did was acceptable. The abbot smiled, a gentle, understanding smile. You are confusing kindness with approval. They are not the same. Imagine you come across a small child who has fallen and scraped his knee. He is crying, not just from the pain, but from the shock and the foolishness he feels for having tripped. Would you stand over him and say, "You were clumsy. You should have been more careful. You deserve this pain"? Or would you kneel down, help him up, and speak to him with a gentle voice, tending to his wound? I would help the child, of course, Kaito said, without hesitation. And in that moment of helping him, the abbot asked, "Are you approving of his clumsiness? Are you saying it was a good thing that he fell?" No. You are simply responding to his suffering with kindness. You are offering compassion because he is in pain. The reason for the pain is secondary. Master Jinsei's gaze became very direct. Kaito, there is a part of you that is like that small, crying child. The young man on the bridge was arrogant and confused. He was lost in his own pride and fear. He fell. He caused a wound to his sister and to himself. For years, you have been standing over that wounded part of yourself, scolding it, punishing it, telling it that it deserves to suffer. Is it any wonder it has not healed? He gave Kaito a new instruction. Each day, after his morning meditation, he was to find a quiet place and practice offering metta to himself. The practice was simple. He was to sit quietly and silently, repeat a few short phrases, letting the feeling behind the words be more important than the words themselves. The next morning, Kaito went to the small herb garden behind the kitchen, a place that had become a quiet sanctuary for him. He sat on his stone, the air cool and fragrant with mint. He closed his eyes and tried to begin. The phrases the abbot had suggested felt foreign and awkward in his mind. May I be safe. His inner critic, the blacksmith, who had been quiet for some time, roared back to life. Safe? You caused your sister to feel unsafe in her own home. You don't deserve safety. He tried again, his jaw tightening. May I be healthy. The voice sneered. Your heart is sick with guilt. This is your true health. He pushed on, his frustration growing. May I be happy. This time, the voice was a cruel laugh. Happiness? You built your monastic life on the foundation of your family's unhappiness. How dare you wish for joy? He tried the last phrase. May I live with ease. Your life should be hard. Your path should be one of penance. Ease is for those with clear hearts. Kaito opened his eyes, his chest tight with a familiar, painful constriction. This was impossible. Every phrase felt like a profound hypocrisy. He felt more like a fraud now than he had in months. He was trying to plant flowers in a field of solid rock. He struggled with the practice for several days, each attempt ending in the same frustrating battle with his own mind. He felt defeated, as if he had encountered a wall he could not climb. He went to the abbot and confessed his failure. I cannot do it, Master, he said, his voice full of despair. The words are empty. My heart rejects them. It feels like I am lying to myself.
Master Jinsei listened patiently, his expression unchanging. When Kaito was finished, he said, "You are trying to offer kindness to the idea of Kaito the bad brother. That idea is a fortress of judgment. Of course it will not accept your kindness. You must find the suffering child inside the fortress." He offered a new approach. Do not think of yourself as you are now. Go back in your mind. Find the young man on the bridge. See him clearly. See his pride, which was a mask for his fear of leaving home. See his arrogance, which was a cover for his insecurity about the path he had chosen. See his confusion. He was not a monster, Kaito. He was a young, foolish boy who was in his own kind of pain. Can you find it in your heart to feel a little compassion for him? This was a radical shift in perspective. Kaito had always seen his younger self as a villain to be condemned. He had never thought to look for the suffering behind the arrogance. He returned to the herb garden the next morning. He sat and took a few deep breaths, letting the tension in his body soften. Then he did as the abbot had instructed. He brought the image of his younger self to mind. He saw the stiff set of his shoulders, the defiant tilt of his chin. He saw the way his eyes avoided his sister's, unable to meet her simple, loving gaze. At first, the usual wave of condemnation arose, but he looked closer, as if he were observing a stranger. He saw the flicker of fear in the young man's eyes. He saw the desperate need to prove himself, to appear strong and enlightened. He saw a boy who was terribly afraid of being pulled back into a world he felt he needed to escape. A boy who used the Dharma as a sword to cut ties, because he did not yet know how to use it as a balm to heal them. And for the first time, Kaito felt a flicker of something other than anger toward this younger version of himself. It was a pang of sadness, a flicker of pity. It was the beginning of compassion. He held this image of the confused, arrogant, and suffering boy in his mind, and he began to offer the phrases of metta, not to himself now, but to him. May you be safe from your own pride and fear. This time, the words did not feel like a lie. They felt like a sincere wish, a gentle prayer. May you be healthy, and may your heart heal from its confusion. A warmth began to spread in his chest, a gentle, unfamiliar sensation. May you be happy, and may you find the true happiness that comes from kindness, not from pride. Tears began to well in his eyes, but they were not the hot tears of shame. They were warm, cleansing tears of compassion. May you live with ease, and may you find your way off this difficult path of your own making. He continued repeating the phrases, his heart softening with each repetition. The image of his younger self seemed to soften too. The defiant posture relaxed. The arrogant expression dissolved, replaced by a look of profound, weary sadness. Kaito felt a deep, instinctual urge to reach out to this boy, to comfort him, to tell him that it would be all right. In that moment, he was no longer the judge and the judged. He was the comforter and the comforted. The division in his own heart began to dissolve. The stone, which had been softened by the river of impermanence, now began to truly melt under the gentle, steady warmth of his own compassion. It was like a block of ice, slowly, finally beginning to thaw, releasing the living water that had been trapped inside for so long. He had planted the seed. In the barren, trampled field of his heart, a single green shoot of self-compassion had finally broken through the hard soil.
It was small, it was fragile, but it was alive, and it was the beginning of a new kind of spring. This practice became Kaito's new anchor. Each morning, he would return to the herb garden and sit with the image of his younger, wounded self. Some days the compassion flowed easily, a warm, gentle current that seemed to wash over the old, painful memories. On these days, he felt a sense of integration, of wholeness, as if he were patiently stitching together two parts of himself that had been torn apart for years. The judge and the prisoner were learning to become friends. Other days were more difficult. The image of the arrogant boy would be sharp and unyielding, and the old feelings of anger and shame would arise with a familiar, bitter taste. On these days, the phrases of metta felt hollow, like empty shells. He would feel the old despair creeping back, the fear that this healing was just a temporary illusion. It was on one such difficult morning that he sought out Master Jinsei. He found him tending to the moss garden, a place of deep shade and profound quiet behind the abbot's quarters. The master was on his hands and knees, carefully removing a single, errant weed from a lush carpet of emerald green moss. His movements were infinitely patient, his attention complete. "Master," Kaito said, his voice tight with frustration. "Some days my heart is open, but today it is closed. It is a hard stone again. The compassion will not come. I feel like a failure." The abbot sat back on his heels and looked at Kaito. He held up the tiny weed between his thumb and forefinger. "When you find a weed in the garden, do you curse the entire garden? Do you declare that it is a failure and will never be beautiful again?" "No, master," Kaito replied. "I simply remove the weed." "And do you remove it with anger?" the abbot asked. "Do you rip it from the earth with violence, disturbing the moss all around it?" "No, that would damage the garden. I try to remove it gently, to disturb the moss as little as possible." "Exactly," Master Jinsei said, placing the small weed into a basket. "Your heart is a garden. There will be days when the flowers of compassion bloom effortlessly, and there will be days when the weeds of judgment and anger grow back. This is the nature of gardens. The practice of metta is not about forcing the flowers to bloom. It is about patiently, gently, and consistently tending the soil. On the days when compassion does not come, the practice is to be compassionate with your lack of compassion." This was another profound shift for Kaito. He had been turning the practice of self-compassion into another task at which he could fail, another standard he was not meeting. He was firing a second arrow at himself for being unable to stop firing second arrows. The abbot continued, "On the days when your heart feels like a stone, do not try to force it to be a flower. Simply offer kindness to the stone. Place your hand on your chest and feel the hardness, the coldness, and then offer the phrases to that feeling. May this hardness be held in kindness. May this coldness be met with warmth. You are not trying to change the stone. You are changing your relationship to it. You are learning to be with it, to hold it, without needing it to be different. That, Kaito, is the essence of compassion." Kaito returned to his practice with this new, gentler understanding. He learned to meet his own resistance with kindness. When the voice of the inner critic arose, he would greet it not as an enemy, but as a confused and suffering part of himself. He would silently say to it, "I see you. I see your fear and your anger. May you be at peace." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the garden of his heart began to change. The soil became softer, more receptive. The moments of open-heartedness became more frequent. The periods of stony resistance shorter and less intense. The compassion he was cultivating for his younger self began to naturally extend to his present self. He found himself being kinder to his own mistakes. When he chipped the bowl in the kitchen, he was able to place a hand on his own chest and feel the pang of frustration, and then offer a silent, "It's okay. It was a mistake." This growing self-compassion began to ripple outward, changing his interactions with others. He had always been a quiet and withdrawn monk, keeping a polite distance, afraid that if others got too close, they would see the fraud he believed himself to be. Now, he found himself more present, more available. He listened with a new quality of attention, not just to the words others spoke, but to the feelings behind them. He saw the other monks not as paragons of virtue against whom he was constantly failing, but as fellow human beings, each with their own invisible wounds, their own secret struggles. He saw the stern, disciplined face of the head cook and recognized the flicker of anxiety in his eyes as he worried about the dwindling supply of winter vegetables. He saw the boastful confidence of a young novice and recognized the deep insecurity it was meant to hide. He was beginning to understand that
compassion was not a finite resource that he had to earn for himself before he could offer it to others. It was a boundless well. The more he drew from it for himself, the more it overflowed for everyone around him. By learning to hold his own suffering with kindness, he was learning to hold the suffering of the world. The seed of self-compassion, so painfully planted, was growing into a tree whose shade was large enough for more than just himself. Part 7. The Wisdom of the Empty Boat. The practice of metta began to till the hard soil of Kaito's heart. The seeds of self-compassion, so tentatively planted, were taking root, and in their quiet, steady growth, they were beginning to break apart the compacted earth of his long-held guilt. He was learning to be a friend to himself, to offer the same gentle care to his own wounds that he would offer to another. This brought a warmth, a softness to his inner world that he had not felt in years. The cold stone in his chest was no longer a lifeless weight. It was a place he was learning to tend with kindness. Yet, a subtle shadow remained. While he was learning to be compassionate toward his younger self, he still held that self as a separate entity, a blameworthy figure who required forgiveness. He was the kind caretaker, and his past self was the patient in need of care. The division, though now bridged by compassion, still existed. He had stopped condemning the prisoner, and had even begun to offer him comfort, but he had not yet fully realized that the prison itself was an illusion. The subtle, underlying belief that a fundamental error had been made by a solid, identifiable someone still lingered, like the last trace of winter's chill in the air on a spring morning. This final layer of his suffering was revealed to him on a cool, rainy afternoon. A steady, gentle rain had been falling since dawn, washing the dust from the temple roofs and turning the moss in the gardens to a shade of impossibly vibrant green. The sound of the rain was a constant, soothing whisper, a natural sutra that seemed to invite introspection. Kaito was in the monastery's main hall, tasked with polishing the wide, dark floorboards.
He worked in a slow, rhythmic motion, the scent of the damp wood and the beeswax polish mingling with the earthy smell of the rain outside. From the corner of his eye, he saw two of the younger novices, Rin and Hero, attempting to carry a large, heavy bronze bell across the courtyard to the workshop for repairs. Their movements were clumsy and uncoordinated. Suddenly, Hero's foot slipped on the wet stones. He lost his grip, and the bell tilted precariously. Rin, unable to hold the weight alone, was forced to let go, and the great bell fell to the ground with a dull, mournful thud. Immediately, Hero's face flushed with anger. "You let go," he accused Rin, his voice sharp. "You were not holding your side properly." "I was holding it," Ren retorted, his own face a mask of defensive anger. "You slipped. If you had watched your footing, this would not have happened." They stood in the rain, glaring at each other, two small figures bristling with blame. The fallen bell lay between them, a silent testament to a shared failure that each was determined to make the other's sole responsibility. Kaito watched them, and a familiar, weary feeling settled over him. He saw in their small, fierce argument a perfect mirror of his own internal battle. For years, his present self had been like Hero, pointing an accusing finger at his past self, Ren, saying, "You let go, you slipped, this is your fault." And his past self, a silent, defenseless ghost, had borne the full weight of the blame. He had been so busy assigning fault that he had failed to see the larger picture, the slippery stones, the heavy bell, the shared circumstance. He was so lost in this reflection that he did not notice Master Jinsei approach until the abbot was standing beside him, his gaze also on the two boys in the courtyard. "When a pot breaks," the abbot said quietly, his voice blending with the sound of the rain, "we can spend our time blaming the person who dropped it, or we can simply begin to gather the pieces. Which path do you think leads more quickly to a mended pot?" Kaito bowed his head. "To gather the pieces, master." "And yet," the abbot continued, his eyes still on the boys, "the mind loves to find someone to blame. It gives us a sense of order, a sense of control. If we can find a villain, we can feel like a victim, or a righteous judge. It is a very powerful story, but it is only a story." He turned to Kaito, his gaze gentle but penetrating. "You have learned to be kind to the one you blame. This is a profound step, but you have not yet questioned the blame itself. You have not yet seen that the one you are angry with may not even be there. Come, let me tell you an old story." He led Kaito to the veranda, and they sat together, watching the rain create 1,000 shimmering circles on the surface of the carp pond. "There was once a man," the abbot began, "a fisherman who lived by a great river. He was a skilled boatman, and he owned a small, sturdy boat that he cared for with immense pride. He kept its wood oiled and its lines neatly coiled. To him, his boat was a reflection of his own competence and discipline. One summer morning, a thick fog rolled in from the sea, blanketing the river in a soft, white silence. The world was reduced to a few feet of gray water around his boat. The fog muffled all sound, creating a sense of deep, dreamlike isolation. The fisherman needed to cross the river to get to the morning market, so he set out, navigating by memory and instinct. He was annoyed by the fog. It was an inconvenience, an obstacle to his purpose. He rowed with strong, steady strokes, his irritation growing with each pull of the oars. He could not see the banks. He could not see the sky. He felt a rising anger at the world for presenting him with this challenge. As he neared the middle of the river, where the current was strongest, there was a sudden jarring crash. Another boat had emerged from the dense fog and struck his own hard on the side. The fisherman's irritation instantly exploded into rage. He cursed the fool who was rowing so carelessly. "You idiot!" he screamed into the thick, white air. "What are you doing? Are you blind? Look what you've done to my boat!" His voice was swallowed by the fog, and there was no reply. This only fueled his fury. He imagined some lazy, incompetent fool in the other boat, perhaps drunk or half asleep. He imagined the man's stupid, unapologetic face. Breathing heavily, his heart pounding with righteous anger, he grabbed his oar, ready to push off the other boat and give its owner a piece of his mind. He maneuvered his boat alongside the other, his mind rehearsing a list of insults and accusations. He peered through the thick mist, ready to unleash his fury upon the fool who had wronged him. And then he saw it. The other boat was empty. There was no one in it. No lazy fool, no drunken idiot, no one to blame. It was just an empty boat, one that had likely slipped its moorings upstream and was simply drifting with the current. It had no intention, no malice, no carelessness. It was just a piece of wood, subject to the whims of the river and the fog. In that instant, the abbot said, looking at Kaito, the fisherman's rage vanished. It had nowhere to go. It was like a great fire that had suddenly been deprived of all its fuel. He could not be angry at an empty boat. The anger, which had felt so solid, so justified, so real just a moment before, now seemed utterly absurd. He was left with only the situation itself, a bump, a dent in his boat, the fog, the river. All the energy he had wasted on blame and fury dissolved into the silent mist. He was left in the quiet presence of what is. The abbot fell silent. The only sound was the steady drumming of the rain. The story settled into Kaito's mind, and he felt a deep, resonant truth in it. A truth that went even deeper than the parable of the second arrow. "For years, Kaito," Master Jinsei said softly, "you have been the fisherman in the fog, and the boat that struck you, the boat you have been screaming at, the boat you have blamed for ruining your peace, is the boat of your younger self. You have been furious with the person who was steering that boat, the arrogant, foolish boy on the bridge. But what if you were to look closer?" the abbot continued. "What if you were to finally peer through the fog of your own judgment and see what was really in that boat? You would not find a malicious villain. You would not find a solid evil person who intended to cause harm. You would find what the fisherman found. You would find an empty boat." Kaito looked at the abbot, his eyes wide with a dawning revolutionary understanding. "Empty?" "Yes, empty," the abbot affirmed. "The young man you were was not acting from a place of solid, independent evil. He was adrift. He was empty of wisdom. He was empty of foresight. He was empty of a true understanding of compassion. His boat was being pushed by powerful, unseen currents. The current of fear, the current of pride, the current of youthful ignorance, the current of a deep, unacknowledged insecurity. He was lost in a thick fog of his own making. He was, in essence, an empty boat, drifting at the mercy of conditions he did not understand and could not control. Your anger, your guilt, your years of self-punishment," the abbot concluded, "have all been directed at a phantom steersman. You have been screaming into the fog at an empty vessel. The blame has no target. The mistake was a collision of conditions. The suffering was your reaction to the collision. Can you be angry at an empty boat?" The question hung in the air, simple and profound. Kaito closed his eyes. He revisited the memory of the bridge, the memory that had been the source of so much pain. But this time, he saw it through the lens of the abbot's story. He saw the young man standing there, not as a cruel perpetrator, but as a vessel, empty of wisdom, filled with the turbulent currents of fear and pride. He saw that the cruel words were not the product of a solid, evil self, but the unfortunate consequence of those currents, of that fog. And with that seeing, the very foundation of his guilt collapsed. It was not a slow melting, as it had been with compassion. It was a sudden, complete dissolution. The entire structure of blame, a structure he had spent years building and reinforcing, simply vanished, because its central pillar, the existence of a blameworthy self, was revealed to be an illusion. It was not that he was forgiving his past self. Forgiveness implies a perpetrator and a victim. What he now understood was that there was no perpetrator to forgive. There was only a set of unfortunate conditions that led to a painful event. There was only a collision in the fog. A profound lightness filled him, a sense of space and freedom so vast it almost made him dizzy. The stone in his chest did not just melt, it evaporated. It turned into mist and dissolved into the vast open sky of his awareness. He was left with only the memory of the event, the clean fact of it, but it was stripped of its toxic charge of blame and shame. It was just something that had happened, like a storm that had passed long ago. As if on cue, the rain began to soften, the steady drumming easing to a gentle patter. A pale, watery sunlight began to break through the clouds, illuminating the raindrops still clinging to the leaves of the trees, turning them into 1,000 tiny jewels. Kaito opened his eyes and looked at the world. It was the same world, the same monastery, the same pond, but he was seeing it with new eyes, from a place of profound, unburdened peace. He was no longer the angry fisherman. He was not the empty boat. He was the river itself, the fog, the rain, the returning sun. He was the whole of the unfolding moment, and in that wholeness, there was no room for blame. There was only a deep, quiet, and unconditional acceptance of what is. The abbot watched the play of emotions on Kaito's face, the shock of recognition, the dissolving of the long-held tension, the dawning of a quiet, spacious peace. He gave a small, knowing smile and then rose to his feet. "The rain has stopped," he said simply. "The pieces of the bell are still waiting." He then turned and walked away, leaving Kaito alone with his newfound freedom. Kaito sat for a long while, letting the truth of the empty boat settle into his bones. It was a truth that resonated far beyond his own personal story. He looked out at the courtyard where Ren and Hiro had argued. They had long since been called away to another task, the fallen bell still lying on the wet stones. He saw their conflict now, in a completely new light. Hiro had been screaming at Ren's empty boat, and Ren had been screaming back at Hiro's. Each boy was lost in his own fog of hurt feelings and defensive pride, blaming a phantom steersman in the other's vessel. Neither could see that the true cause of the accident was a combination of conditions: the heavy bell, their lack of experience, the slippery stones, a moment of shared inattention. There was no single villain, only a web of causes and effects. This insight rippled outward, transforming his perception of the world. He thought of all the conflicts he had witnessed in his life, both inside the monastery and in the village he had left behind. The arguments between neighbors, the resentment between family members, the quiet feuds that could last for generations. He saw that they were all, in essence, variations of the same story, people screaming at empty boats in the fog. They were attributing malice and ill intent to others, who were, more often than not, simply adrift, pushed by the invisible currents of their own fear, ignorance, and suffering. He realized that the practice of compassion was not just about being kind to the suffering of others. It was about understanding the causes of their harmful actions. It was the wisdom to see that when people act cruelly or selfishly or carelessly, they are almost always acting from a place of their own pain. Their boat is empty of wisdom, and they are lost in a fog. To blame them is to misunderstand the nature of their predicament. To see their empty boat is the beginning of true, unconditional compassion. Kaito stood up and walked out into the damp, clean air of the courtyard. He went to the fallen bell and knelt beside it. He ran his hand over its cool bronze surface, tracing the intricate carvings of lotus flowers and celestial beings. He saw a new small dent on its side where it had struck the stone. It was a flaw, a mark of the accident, but it did not make the bell ugly. It was simply part of its story now, a testament to its journey. He looked around and found the heavy wooden mallet used to ring the bell. He positioned it carefully, and with a gentle, focused movement, he struck the bell. It did not produce its usual deep, resonant boom that could be heard for miles. Lying on its side, its voice was muffled, a low, sorrowful hum that seemed to be absorbed by the damp earth. It was a sound of brokenness, of a potential not being met. In that moment, Kaito understood what he had to do. He went to find Ren and Hiro. He found them in the woodshed, sullenly and silently splitting wood, each still wrapped in his own fog of resentment. He bowed to them. "The bell is still in the courtyard," he said, his voice calm and free of any judgment. "It is too heavy for two, but it is not too heavy for three." The two novices looked at him, surprised. They had expected a lecture, a scolding from a senior monk, but Kaito's face held only a quiet, open invitation. Seeing no accusation in his eyes, the boys' defensive postures began to soften. They put down their axes and followed him back to the courtyard. Without a word, the three of them positioned themselves around the heavy bell. "On the count of 3, Kaito said, "we lift together. We will feel the weight as one." He counted, and on 3 they lifted. The bell was still immensely heavy, but with their combined, coordinated effort, it rose from the ground. They moved slowly, carefully, across the slippery stones, their steps synchronized, their breathing falling into a shared rhythm. They were no longer 3 separate individuals, but a single unit with a common purpose. They carried the bell to the workshop and gently lowered it onto the thick wooden blocks that had been prepared for it. Hiro looked at the dent, his face full of shame. "It was my fault," he mumbled, looking at the floor. "I slipped." Before Ren could agree, Kaito placed a hand on his shoulder. "A stone was wet," he said gently. "A bell was heavy. A fog was in the air. The river flows as it flows. Now, let us find the tools to mend what is broken." The anger between the two boys finally dissolved. replaced by a shared sense of purpose. The story of blame had been replaced by the reality of the task at hand. And in that simple shared work, a connection was forged that was stronger than any argument. Kaito had not just learned a lesson. He had begun to embody it. He had stopped screaming at empty boats and had started helping to mend them. Part 8. The Kintsugi Heart. The wisdom of the empty boat had not just removed a burden from Kaito. It had fundamentally reconfigured the landscape of his mind. The world no longer appeared as a stage for heroes and villains, for the righteous and the blameworthy. Instead, he saw a vast, interconnected web of causes and conditions, a river of innumerable interacting currents. He saw that everyone, himself included, was simply a vessel being carried along by these currents, sometimes gracefully, sometimes clumsily, often lost in a fog of their own making. This view did not lead to passivity, but to a profound and active compassion, a desire not to judge or fix, but to understand and assist. His presence in the monastery began to change. The quiet, withdrawn monk who had been lost in his own inner storm became a source of calm, steady presence for others. He did not offer advice or preach doctrines. His teaching was in his way of being. When arguments arose between the novices, he had a gentle way of dissolving the blame, of helping them to see the shared conditions that had led to the conflict. He did not take sides. He simply widened the view, allowing the fog of their anger to dissipate in the light of a larger understanding. Master Jinsei watched this transformation with a quiet, deep satisfaction. He saw that Kaito had moved beyond the intellectual grasp of the teachings and was now beginning to embody them. The final stage of Kaito's healing, the abbot knew, was not just to be at peace with his past, but to see the value in it, to understand how the wound itself, once healed, could become a source of strength and beauty. One day, the abbot called Kaito to his study. On the low table between them sat a simple, beautiful ceramic tea bowl. It was a deep, earthy brown, with a subtle glaze that shimmered with hints of blue and gray. Kaito recognized it as one of the abbot's favorites, a piece made by a master craftsman generations ago. As he looked closer, however, he saw that the bowl was broken. A network of fine cracks ran through it, and a small triangular piece was missing from the rim. "This morning," the abbot said, his voice calm, "my hand slipped as I was washing this bowl. It fell against the stone basin." Kaito felt a pang of sympathy for the abbot's loss. The bowl was a treasure, an irreplaceable work of art. "I am sorry, master. It was a beautiful piece." "It is a beautiful piece," the abbot corrected him gently. "Its story is not over. In fact, it is just about to become more beautiful, more complete. Today, you and I will learn the art of kintsugi." Kaito had heard of this practice. It was the traditional Japanese art of repairing broken pottery, not by hiding the cracks, but by mending them with lacquer mixed with powdered gold, silver, or platinum. The philosophy behind it was that the breakage and repair are part of the history of an object, rather than something to be concealed. The abbot had a small tray with all the necessary materials: fine brushes, a pot of dark sticky lacquer made from tree sap, and a small, precious vial of powdered gold. "The first step," Master Jinsei said, "is to gather all the pieces, even the smallest ones." He gestured to the bowl. "But as you can see, one small piece is lost forever. We cannot recreate it. We must accept its absence. Our repair will have to honor this empty space. The first lesson struck Kaito deeply. He thought of his own past. He could not go back and find the missing piece of his kindness to his sister. He could not undo the harsh words. He had to accept the absence, the imperfection of the past, and begin the repair from there. Under the abbot's guidance, Kaito began the painstaking process. He carefully cleaned the broken edges of the bowl. Then, with a fine-tipped tool, he applied the dark, sticky lacquer to the edges of the largest crack. It was slow, meticulous work that required absolute presence of mind. His breath had to be steady, his hand unwavering. "You see," the abbot said as Kaito worked, "we are not simply gluing the pieces back together. We are tracing the lines of the wound. We are giving it our full, compassionate attention. We are honoring the path the breakage took. We do not resent the crack. We see it as the place where a new kind of beauty can be born." Kaito felt the truth of these words resonate with his own journey. He had spent years resenting the crack in his own heart. He had tried to hide it, to pretend it wasn't there. Then, he had learned to sit with it, to observe it. Now, he was learning to trace its lines with gold. Once the lacquer was applied, the abbot showed him how to carefully press the pieces back together, holding them with gentle, steady pressure, until the initial bond was formed. The bowl was whole again, but scarred with a dark, ugly line of wet lacquer. "Now comes the part that requires the most patience," the abbot said. "The lacquer must dry and harden. This cannot be rushed. It can take days or even weeks depending on the humidity and the temperature. During this time, the bowl is more vulnerable than ever. It must be kept in a safe, still place, and simply allowed to heal in its own time." They placed the bowl in a quiet, protected box. For the next week, Kaito's daily life continued, but he was always aware of the broken bowl, resting in the darkness, slowly, invisibly, mending itself. He understood the metaphor. His own healing had not been a sudden event, but a slow, patient process. The insights he had gained were the lacquer, binding the broken pieces of himself together. But the true hardening, the deep internal strengthening, was happening in the quiet, unseen spaces of his daily practice, in the patient stillness of his meditation. Finally, the day came when the abbot declared the lacquer was fully cured. He took the bowl from its box. It was whole and strong, but the cracks were still visible as thin, dark lines, like scars. "Now for the final step," Master Jinsei said, opening the vial of powdered gold. "Now we illuminate the scars." He showed Kaito how to mix the fine gold powder with a clear top coat of lacquer, creating a shimmering liquid gold. Then, with the finest of brushes, Kaito began the delicate work of tracing the dark lines of the cracks with this precious mixture. It was like painting with light. The brush followed the jagged, unpredictable path of the original breakage. With each stroke, what had been a mark of damage was transformed into a line of beauty. The dark scar became a river of gold. He paid special attention to the missing piece at the rim. Instead of trying to hide the gap, he filled it completely with the golden lacquer, creating a new shape, a crescent of pure solid gold that completed the circle of the rim. The absence itself had become a jewel. When he was finished, he held the bowl in his hands and looked at it in awe. It was no longer the perfect, flawless bowl it had once been. It was something far more beautiful. It was a map of its own history. The golden lines were not just decoration. They were a testament to its resilience. They told the story of being broken and then being made whole again. Not just in spite of its wounds, but because of them. The bowl was more beautiful for having been broken. "This, Kaido," the abbot said softly, "is your heart. For years, you saw your past mistake as an ugly crack, a flaw that made you unworthy and impure. You tried to hide it, and in doing so, you remained broken. But then you learned to sit with the wound. You learned to stop adding new injuries. You learned to hold the broken pieces with compassion. You applied the lacquer of wisdom and the patience of practice." He gestured to the bowl in Kaido's hands. "And now you see the final truth. The wound itself, when healed with loving kindness and wisdom, does not have to be a scar you hide forever. It can become a line of gold. The place where you were most broken can become your greatest source of strength, of beauty, and of compassion for others. Your cruelty to your sister has become the very thing that has taught you the true meaning of kindness. The arrogance of your youth has become the fertile ground in which your humility is grown. The missing piece, the part of your past you can never change, has become a jewel of acceptance in the rim of your heart." Kaido looked at the golden lines, shimmering in the light. He saw his own journey traced there. The jagged line of guilt, the sharp edge of self-recrimination, the deep fissure of despair, all of it was now illuminated, transformed. He understood that his past was not a source of shame, it was the source of his wisdom. Without the wound, he would never have undertaken this profound journey of healing. He would have remained a competent but shallow monk, his heart unbroken, but also unopened. The crack was what had let the light in. He realized that true wholeness is not about being perfect and unbroken. It is about integrating all the parts of ourselves, including the broken ones, with love and acceptance. It is about having the courage to illuminate our own scars, to see them not as signs of failure, but as proof of our resilience, as the unique and beautiful story of our own kintsugi heart. He bowed to the abbot, his heart so full of gratitude it felt like a perfectly whole and mended bowl. He was no longer ashamed of his past. He was not even just at peace with it. He was, in a quiet and profound way, grateful for it. For it had been the hammer that had broken him open, and the gold that had made him whole. The mended tea bowl became a central object in Kaito's practice. Master Jinsei placed it in the small tea room, and it was used during the most important ceremonies. Each time Kaito held it, he felt the story of its, and his own, transformation. His fingers would trace the slightly raised golden lines, feeling the intricate map of its past. He no longer saw cracks. He saw veins of light. He no longer felt a repaired object. He felt a story of resilience made tangible. This new understanding began to subtly reshape his interactions with the world. He started to see the golden cracks in everyone he met. He looked at the stern face of the monastery's disciplinarian, a monk known for his rigid adherence to the rules. And instead of seeing only harshness, Kaito began to perceive the deep, unspoken fear of chaos that lay beneath it. A crack that the monk had tried to hide with a thick lacquer of control. Kaito found himself feeling not resentment for the monk's rigidity, but a quiet compassion for the fear that fueled it. He saw the boastfulness of a young novice not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a golden seam filling the space where a piece of self-worth had been lost. He saw the quiet sadness of an elderly monk not as a sign of spiritual failure, but as a beautiful, intricate network of golden lines, each one tracing a story of loss, love, and a life fully lived. He realized that the people he had once judged most harshly were often the ones with the most profound, though perhaps unilluminated, cracks. Their anger, their pride, their fear, these were not their true selves. They were the clumsy, desperate ways they had tried to hold their own broken pieces together. They were applying a dark, rough lacquer, not yet knowing that it could one day be traced with gold. This insight gave him a new kind of patience. He was no longer in a hurry to fix people or correct their behavior. He understood that healing, like the curing of the lacquer, cannot be rushed. It requires a safe, still, and compassionate space. His role was not to be a craftsman, but to be the quiet, protected box in which others could begin their own slow, invisible mending. One day, a message arrived from Kaito's home village. It was a simple, formal note, informing the monastery that his mother's health was failing and that she was asking to see him. The news struck Kaito with a complex mix of emotions. There was the clean pain of the first arrow, the sadness of his mother's illness, the fear of losing her. But he watched his mind carefully, observing its immediate impulse to reach for the second arrow. The old voice of the blacksmith whispered, "It is your fault. You abandoned her. If you had been a better son, she would not be suffering." Years ago, this arrow would have pierced him to the core, plunging him into a deep well of guilt and despair. But now he had the tools to meet it. He saw the bow being raised. He felt the familiar tension of the old story, and he gently, with a compassion born of long practice, put the bow down. He acknowledged the thought of blame as an empty boat, a phantom steersman trying to take control. He let it drift by. What remained was the clean, pure feeling of love and sadness for his mother. He went to Master Jinsei, his heart heavy but clear. The abbot listened to the news and looked at Kaito's face. He saw no turmoil there, only a deep, quiet sorrow. "You must go," he said simply. "Your practice has prepared you for this. Go with an open heart. Go as the person you are now, not the person you were then." The journey back to his village was a pilgrimage through his own past. He walked the same dusty road he had walked as an arrogant boy, but he saw it with new eyes. He saw the beauty in the wildflowers growing by the roadside, the strength in the ancient gnarled trees. He was not rushing toward a future of imagined enlightenment, nor was he fleeing a past of messy attachments. He was simply walking, one mindful step at a time, fully present in the journey itself. When he arrived at the village, it was both familiar and strange. The old stone bridge was still there, but it seemed smaller. The houses were the same, but the people he passed were older. He realized how much he had held the village in his mind as a static, unchanging place, a backdrop for his own drama. But the river of time had flowed here too. He found his family home. His sister Emmy answered the door. She was a woman now, her face etched with the lines of care and responsibility. But her eyes were the same, bright and clear. For a moment they stood in silence, the years of separation a wide, unspoken river between them. Kaito saw a flicker of old hurt in her eyes, a memory of the boy who had walked away. But he also saw curiosity and a weary adult understanding. He did not offer a grand dramatic apology. The wisdom of Kintsugi had taught him that some things cannot be perfectly pieced back together. Instead, he simply bowed, a deep, humble bow, not from a monk to a layperson, but from a brother to a sister. In that bow, he poured all the regret, all the compassion, all the healing of the intervening years. It was a silent admission of his past fault and a quiet offering of his present self. Emmy watched him, and a slow, sad smile touched her lips. She nodded, a gesture of acceptance, and opened the door wider. "She is waiting for you," she said. His mother was frail, lying on a
futon near the window, but her mind was clear. She looked at her son, this tall, quiet man in a monk's robe, and her eyes filled with tears. "You came," she whispered. Kaito knelt beside her and took her thin, cool hand. He did not know what to say. The years of Zen practice had taught him the value of silence, but here he felt that words were needed. And then he realized that the most honest thing he could offer was the truth of his own journey. He began to speak, his voice low and steady. He did not make excuses for his past behavior. He simply told her his story. He told her about the stone in his heart, about the unseen chains, about the second arrow. He told her about the river of impermanence and the wisdom of the empty boat. And finally, he told her about the Kintsugi heart, about how the very crack he had created on the day he left had, through a long and painful process, become the source of his deepest understanding and compassion. He spoke for a long time, not as a monk teaching a doctrine, but as a son sharing his heart. He was tracing the golden lines of his own mended soul for her to see. When he finished, the room was quiet, filled only with the soft sound of their breathing. His mother looked at him, her gaze full of a deep, maternal love. "So," she said, her voice weak but clear, "my son had to break his heart in order to find it." In that moment, Kaito felt the final piece of the bowl click into place. The golden lacquer settled and hardened, and he felt a sense of wholeness that was deeper than anything he had ever known. His healing was no longer just his own. By sharing it, by offering the story of his wound as a gift, he had mended something between them, something that had been broken for a very long time. The past was not erased, but it was illuminated. It was no longer a source of shame, but a shared story of resilience, a testament to the strange and beautiful way that life can break us in the very places where we most need to grow. Part 9. The Freedom of the Open Sky. Kaito stayed in his village for several weeks, a quiet presence in his family's home. The rhythm of his days shifted from the structured discipline of the monastery to the gentle, unpredictable flow of caring for his mother. He no longer rose to the sound of a wooden han, but to the first bird song outside the window. His meditation was not confined to a cushion in the zendo, but was woven into the simple, sacred acts of preparing his mother's tea, of reading to her from her favorite books of poetry, of simply sitting by her side in companionable silence as the afternoon light slanted across the tatami mats. This was a different kind of practice, one that tested his newfound peace in the crucible of old relationships and intimate sorrows. The boy who had fled the village in search of a pure, transcendent stillness was gone. In his place was a man who was discovering a stillness that could coexist with the messiness of life, a peace that could hold the profound sadness of his mother's decline without being broken by it. His relationship with his sister Emmy slowly, cautiously, began to mend. There were no grand conversations of forgiveness. Instead, their healing happened in the small, unspoken moments. It happened when he quietly took over the task of chopping wood for the fire, his movements steady and mindful, and she watched him from the kitchen with a look of surprised gratitude.
It happened when they worked together in the small vegetable garden, their hands in the same soil, their movements falling into an easy, familiar rhythm. It happened one evening when he found her weeping quietly on the veranda, overwhelmed by the impending loss of their mother, and he simply sat beside her, his silent, compassionate presence a solid anchor in her sea of grief. He did not offer empty platitudes or Zen wisdom. He just sat with her, sharing the clean, honest pain of the first arrow. In these moments, Emmy began to see that the brother who had returned was not the brother who had left. The arrogant, self-absorbed boy was gone. In his place was a man with a quiet strength, a man whose eyes held a deep, sorrowful kindness. The old wound between them, the crack in their relationship, was slowly being traced with the gold of these new, shared moments. Kaito's mother passed away on a cool autumn morning, as peacefully as a leaf letting go of a branch. Her passing was not a moment of dramatic suffering, but a quiet, gentle release. Kaito and Emmy were with her, holding her hands. In the profound silence that followed her last breath, Kaito felt not the sharp, tearing agony of loss he might have once expected, but a vast, deep, and tender sorrow that was indistinguishable from love. He was fully present with the pain, and because he did not fire a second arrow of guilt or regret, the pain was clean. It was the pure, sacred pain of a heart that has loved and is now letting go. After the simple village funeral, Kaito knew it was time to return to the monastery. His farewell with Emmy was as quiet and profound as their reunion. They stood on the old stone bridge, the very spot where their painful separation had occurred years ago. The circle was now complete. "Will you come back?" Emmy asked, her voice soft. "The monastery is my home," Kaito replied gently, "but this village is my root. I will not be a stranger again." He bowed to her, and she bowed in return. There was no need for any more words. The mended bowl of their relationship was now strong, its golden lines a testament to the healing that had taken place. As he walked away, he did not turn his back with a sense of hollow victory, but with a heart full of a quiet, peaceful love. He looked back once and saw her still standing on the bridge, and he raised a hand, not in farewell, but in connection. The journey back to the monastery was a walking meditation. Every step, he felt a sense of lightness, of release. The final, deepest roots of his old suffering had been pulled, not with force, but with the gentle, persistent power of presence and compassion. The stone in his heart was well and truly gone. He placed his hand on his chest, and where there had once been a cold, heavy weight, he now felt only a sense of warmth, of openness, of a vast, quiet space. He arrived back at the monastery gates as the sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows across the courtyard. He felt as though he had been away for a lifetime, and yet also as if he had never left. He was returning to the same place, but he was not the same man. Over the next few days, he settled back into the monastic routine, but his experience of it was transformed. The silence of the zendo was no longer a roaring chamber for his guilt, but a vast open sky in which his thoughts and feelings could arise and pass like clouds. He sat on his cushion, and his body was at ease. His breath was deep and slow, moving freely through a torso that was no longer constricted by a heavy stone. His mind, once a turbulent, churning sea, was now as calm and clear as the monastery's carp pond on a windless morning. He realized that for years he had been meditating with a clenched fist in the center of his being. Now the fist had opened, and in its open palm was not emptiness, but a gentle, all-encompassing awareness. He could feel the subtle vibrations of the morning chants in the wooden floorboards. He could hear the individual voices of the crickets in the evening chorus. He could taste the simple, profound flavor of a single grain of rice. His senses were alive, his awareness unburdened. He was no longer living in the cramped, dark room of his own story. He was living in the world. This inner freedom manifested as a quiet joy. It was not a loud, ecstatic happiness, but a gentle, pervasive sense of well-being, a deep contentment with the simple reality of the present moment. He found a quiet delight in the most mundane tasks. Sweeping the fallen leaves became a graceful dance. Chopping wood became a powerful rhythm. Polishing the temple floors became an act of devotion. He was no longer performing these tasks as a penance or a distraction. He was doing them for their own sake, and in that simple, direct engagement, he found a profound sense of peace and purpose. The other monks noticed the change. Kaito had always been respected for his discipline, but now he was sought out for his presence. There was a quality of deep listening in his silence, a warmth in his gaze that made others feel seen and accepted. The younger novices, who had once been intimidated by his seriousness, now came to him with their troubles, sensing instinctively that he would not judge them. He would simply listen, his calm presence a silent invitation for them to find their own wisdom, to see their own empty boats. One afternoon, Master Jinsei found Kaito sitting on the veranda, overlooking the mountains. The sky was a vast, cloudless expanse of the deepest blue. Kaito was not meditating in a formal sense. He was just sitting, his gaze soft, his posture relaxed but upright. He seemed to be completely absorbed in the great, open space before him. The abbot sat beside him, and for a long time neither of them spoke. They simply shared the silence and the immense vista. Finally, the abbot said, "The stone in your heart seems to have become a feather." Kaito turned to his master, and his face broke into a smile. It was a genuine, unburdened smile. A smile that reached all the way to his eyes. It was a smile the abbot had never seen on him before. "Master," Kaito said, his voice full of a quiet wonder, "there is no stone. There is no feather. There is only sky." He had come to the deepest realization of all. His journey had not been about replacing a heavy object with a light one. It had been about realizing that his true nature was not the object at all, but the space in which all objects, heavy or light, painful or pleasant, appear. His true nature was the open, boundless, sky-like awareness itself. The guilt, the shame, the stone, the second arrows, they had all been clouds. For years he had mistaken himself for a dark and stormy cloud, believing that was his permanent identity. But through his long journey of practice, the clouds had slowly parted, and what he had discovered underneath was not a healed cloud, but the clear, open, and unchanging blue sky that had been there all along. The sky does not resent the clouds. It does not try to push them away. It simply allows them to be, to float through its vastness, to change their shape, and to eventually dissolve, knowing that they cannot stain or harm its own essential nature. This was the ultimate freedom. It was not the freedom from pain, but the freedom from identifying with pain. It was the freedom of the open sky. He was no longer a kintsugi heart, a beautiful but still defined object. He was the space in which all hearts, broken and whole, are held. He looked out at the mountains, at the vast expanse of the sky, and he took a deep, slow breath. The air filled his lungs, and he felt the boundaries between himself and the world dissolve. His breath was the wind moving through the pines. His stillness was the stillness of the ancient mountains. His awareness was the vast, open, and infinitely peaceful sky. The struggle was over. The journey was complete. He was finally, simply, home. This profound shift from a mended heart to an open sky was not a dramatic, thunderclap enlightenment, but a quiet, deep settling into his own true nature. It was like a cup of water, stirred and cloudy for years, finally being allowed to rest, its sediment gently sinking to the bottom, revealing the perfect clarity that was always its inherent quality. The joy he felt was not an emotional high, but a fundamental sense of rightness, of being perfectly aligned with the flow of life. He moved through the monastery like water, effortlessly finding the path of least resistance, yet with a quiet strength that could wear away stone. His actions were no longer driven by a desire to prove his worth or atone for his past. They arose spontaneously from the needs of the moment, as natural and unself-conscious as a flower turning toward the sun. He began to spend more time in the monastery's extensive library, a place he had once avoided because the profound wisdom in the ancient scrolls had only served to highlight his own sense of inadequacy. Now, he read the words of the great masters of the past, not as a student struggling to understand, but as a traveler, recognizing a description of a landscape he had finally visited himself. He would read a passage from a Zen master. The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. When love and hate are both absent, everything becomes clear and undisguised. He would smile, not with the pride of intellectual comprehension, but with the quiet recognition of a lived truth. He remembered his long war with his own past, his desperate preference for a different history, a different self. He saw how that preference, that intense aversion to what was, had been the very source of his blindness. Now, with the preference gone, the simple, clear reality of the present moment was all that remained. He read another passage. If you want to see the truth, then hold no opinion for or against anything. To set up what you like against what you dislike is the disease of the mind. He saw the years he had spent in the grip of that disease, setting up the good monk he wanted to be against the bad brother he believed he was. This internal conflict had been the engine of his suffering. Now, with the conflict ceased, the mind was no longer diseased. It was healthy, whole, and at peace. His greatest joy, however, was found not in the scrolls, but in the deep silence of the zendo. Sitting in meditation was no longer a practice or a discipline. It was a homecoming. He would settle onto his cushion, and the sense of a separate sitter would gently dissolve. There was no kaito trying to be mindful. There was only mindfulness. There was only the silent, spacious awareness in which the sensations of the body, the sounds of the room, and the thoughts that drifted by were all experienced as a single, unified field. Sometimes, in the depths of this stillness, a memory of the bridge would arise. The image of his sister's face, the sound of his own harsh words. But now, the memory was like a stone dropping into a vast ocean. It created a few ripples on the surface of his awareness, and then it sank, disappearing into the immense, silent depths, leaving the surface of the ocean as calm and undisturbed as it was before. The memory no longer had the power to define him, any more than a single stone can define the entire ocean. The other.
Monks, especially the younger ones, were drawn to this profound and simple peace. They would see him sitting on the veranda, and his stillness was so complete that birds would sometimes land near him, unafraid. They would see him working in the garden, and his movements were so fluid and present that the work seemed more like a form of prayer. One of the novices, the boy Ren, who had once argued with Hiro over the fallen bell, came to Kaito one day, his face a knot of anxiety. "Kaito-san," he said, using a respectful title, "my mind will not be quiet. I try to meditate, but it is full of angry thoughts about Hiro. I try to work, but I am clumsy because my mind is elsewhere. I feel like a failure." Years ago, Kaito might have offered a piece of Zen wisdom, a quote from a sutra, or a stern instruction to practice harder. But now he did something different. He simply looked at Ren, his gaze full of a deep, unconditional acceptance. He did not try to solve the boy's problem. He simply created a space of profound, non-judgmental presence in which the boy could experience his own turmoil without shame. "It is difficult when the mind is like a stormy sea," Kaito said, his voice as calm as still water. "The waves are very powerful." He did not say, "You must calm the waves." He did not say, "The waves are your fault." He simply acknowledged the reality of the boy's experience. Ren looked at him, his anxious eyes searching Kaito's calm face. "What should I do?" he pleaded. Kaito thought for a moment, and then he gestured to the sky. It was a day of mixed weather. Great, white, fluffy clouds drifted lazily across the blue, while on the horizon, a bank of dark, heavy storm clouds was gathering. "Are you the white clouds, Ren?" Kaito asked gently. "No," the boy said, confused. "Are you the dark clouds?" "No." "Are you the blue sky that holds them both?" Ren was silent for a long moment, his gaze shifting from the clouds to Kaito's face and back again. A flicker of understanding dawned in his eyes. "The mind will have its weather," Kaito said softly. "There will be sunny days and there will be stormy days. The practice is not to try to control the weather. The practice is to remember that you are the sky." He then stood up and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Now," he said with a gentle smile, "let us go find Hiro. I think the temple gutters need to be cleaned before the storm arrives. It is a task that is much easier with 3. This was the essence of his new way of being. He did not offer abstract solutions. He offered his presence. He did not give lectures. He invited others into shared, mindful activity. He was not teaching Zen. He was living it. His own liberation had become a quiet, radiant source of liberation for those around him. He had become a living example of the freedom of the open sky, a quiet reminder to all that no matter how dark the clouds their own suffering might seem, the vast, clear, and peaceful sky of their true nature was always and already there. Part 10. Breathing again in the present moment. The seasons turned, each one unfolding with a quiet, unhurried grace that Kaito now saw as a reflection of his own inner state. The vibrant greens of summer softened into the fiery reds and golds of autumn. The first snows of winter fell, blanketing the monastery in a deep, hallowed silence. And then, inevitably, the first green shoots of spring pushed their way through the thawing earth, a testament to the ceaseless cycle of renewal. Kaito lived through these seasons, not as a passive observer, but as an active, joyful participant in their rhythm. He was no longer a man struggling against the current of his life. He was the current itself. His nights, once a landscape of torment and sleepless anxiety, were now a welcome refuge of deep, restorative peace. He would lie down on his simple futon, and the boundary between his body and the stillness of his small cell would seem to dissolve. He would listen to the sound of the wind in the pines, not as an external noise, but as a kind of breathing, a lullaby sung by the world itself. Sleep would come to him not as an escape, but as a gentle, trusting surrender, a letting go into the vast, dark, and peaceful mystery from which all life arises. He would awaken in the pre-dawn darkness, not with a jolt, but with a slow, gentle return to awareness, like a diver surfacing from a deep, calm sea. The first conscious breath of the day was a moment of quiet celebration, a fresh beginning, a gift. The stone was gone. The chains were gone. The archer and the arrows were gone. All that remained was the simple, profound, and miraculous reality of the present moment. He would rise, put on his robes, and walk to the zendo, his bare feet silent on the cold, dark floorboards, his heart as open and clear as the morning sky that was just beginning to lighten in the east. His presence in the monastery had become a kind of silent teaching. The other monks, without ever being told, began to absorb his way of being. They saw the way he handled a simple tea bowl with a reverence that transformed it into a sacred object. They saw the way he listened to another's words, his attention so complete that it seemed to draw the truth from them. They saw the way he met life's small frustrations, a tool that broke, a sudden downpour during outdoor work, not with anger or resignation, but with a quiet, unshakable equanimity, a gentle acceptance of what is. He never spoke of his past, of the great burden he had carried for so long. There was no need. His healing was not in a story he could tell. It was in the peace that radiated from him, in the gentle compassion that informed his every action. He had become a living embodiment of the kintsugi heart, but the golden lines were no longer visible as scars. They had been so, fully integrated into his being, that they had become the very source of the light that shone from him. One day, many years after his return from his village, a young man arrived at the monastery, his face a mask of anguish, his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. He asked to speak with the abbot, and Master Jinsei, now very old, his movements slow and deliberate, received him. The young man confessed that he was haunted by a terrible mistake from his past, an act of betrayal that had poisoned his life and from which he could find no escape. He spoke of a heavy stone in his chest, of sleepless nights, of a feeling of being a fraud in his own life. Master Jinsei listened with his deep, unwavering compassion. When the young man was finished, the old abbot did not offer a lecture or a parable. He simply said, "There is a monk here who may be able to help you. His name is Kaito. Go and work alongside him. Do not ask him for answers. Just observe his way of being." And so, the young man, whose name was Kenji, was assigned to be Kaito's assistant. He followed Kaito through his daily routine, expecting to be taught, to be given some secret that would dissolve his pain. But Kaito offered no such thing. He simply included Kenji in his work. They swept the leaves in the courtyard together. Kenji swept with a frantic, desperate energy, his mind 1,000 miles away, lost in his own inner turmoil.
Kaito swept with a slow, graceful rhythm, his attention fully on the feel of the bamboo broom, the sound of the leaves, the pattern they made on the gravel. He did not tell Kenji to be more mindful, he simply embodied mindfulness, and the quiet rhythm of his sweeping was a silent invitation for Kenji's own agitated rhythm to slow down, to find its own peace. They chopped wood together. Kenji attacked the logs with a furious anger, as if trying to destroy his own pain. Kaito's axe rose and fell with a powerful, centered grace, his breath and his movement a single unified action. He did not tell Kenji to let go of his anger. He simply demonstrated a strength that was free from aggression, a power that came from alignment, not from force. They sat in the zendo together. Kenji fidgeted on his cushion, his body a landscape of tension, his mind a raging battlefield. Kaito sat beside him, a mountain of stillness. His presence was not a judgment on Kenji's restlessness. It was an anchor, a silent reminder that a state of deep, unshakable peace was possible, that it was not a distant dream, but a present reality, right here, in this room. Days turned into weeks. Kenji's frustration grew. He had come for a cure, for a magic word, and all he had received was silence and sweeping. One afternoon, his patience finally broke. He found Kaito polishing the floor of the main hall, his movements slow and circular. "Why won't you teach me?" Kenji burst out, his voice raw with pain. "The abbot said you could help me, but you say nothing. My heart is breaking, and you just polish the floor." Kaito stopped his work. He dipped his cloth into the bucket of cool, clean water, wrung it out, and then turned to face the young man. He looked at Kenji, and in his gaze, Kenji saw not a serene and distant master, but a man who understood his pain completely. Kaito's eyes held a compassion so deep, so vast, that Kenji felt the tight knot of his own defenses begin to unravel. "Your heart is not breaking," Kaito said, his voice as gentle as the rain. "It is learning to breathe. But it has been held tight for so long, it has forgotten how. The first breaths are always painful." He gestured to the floor he had been polishing. The dark ancient wood gleamed, reflecting the light from the open doors like the surface of a still dark lake. "The abbot did not send you to me to learn a secret," Kaito said. "He sent you here to learn how to polish the floor. He sent you here to learn how to sweep the leaves. He sent you here to learn how to sit, and to chop wood, and to wash your bowl." He took a step closer, his presence calm and grounding. "Your suffering is not in your past. It is in your mind's refusal to be here, now, in this moment. Your mind is always telling a story about the past, a story about the person you were. And because you are lost in that story, you are not here, polishing this floor. You are not here, feeling the cool water on your hands. You are not here, breathing this air." He dipped the cloth in the water again and handed it to Kenji. The path to freedom is not found in a grand idea or a sudden insight. It is found under your own 2 feet. It is found in your own 2 hands. It is found in this breath, and this one, and this one. He looked at Kenji with a profound kindness. "Stop trying to fix your heart. Stop trying to escape your past. Just for a moment, be here. Put your full attention, your whole heart, into this simple task. Polish this small section of the floor. Make it the most important thing in the universe, and see what happens." Kenji took the cloth. He looked at the anguish in his own heart, and then he looked at the quiet, unwavering peace in Kaito's face. He knelt down. He took a breath, and he began to polish the floor. At first, his movements were stiff, his mind still racing. But he kept bringing his attention back, just as Kaito had instructed. Back to the feel of the damp cloth, back to the scent of the wood, back to the circular motion of his own hand. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. The roaring of his mind began to quiet down. The frantic energy in his body began to subside. For a single precious moment, he was not Kenji the tormented soul. He was just a pair of hands, polishing a floor. And in that moment, he felt a flicker of peace, a tiny clearing in the dense, stormy forest of his mind. He looked up at Kaido, his eyes wide with a new and fragile hope. Kaido smiled, the same smile that had once been a stranger to his own face. It was a smile of deep understanding, of shared humanity. He knelt down beside Kenji, took up his own cloth, and together, in a shared silent rhythm, they continued to polish the floor, their movements a quiet prayer, their breathing a silent sutra. Kaito knew that the young man's journey was just beginning. There would be many more storms, many more moments of despair. But the first true breath had been taken. The heart, constricted for so long by the suffocating grip of the past, was finally, tentatively, learning to breathe again in the simple, sacred, and infinitely healing reality of the present moment. In Kaito, the monk who had once been lost in the very same forest was now the quiet, steady presence that held the lamp, illuminating the path that leads not to a new destination, but to the simple, profound, and ever-present peace of home.